Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most awkwardly fascinating corners of history. Medieval S3x rules, what they were, who made them, and how everyone managed to break them anyway. Yes, this is real. The Middle Ages weren't just knights and castles, they were also a centuries-long experiment in controlling human desire with an ever-growing list of sins, most of which, frankly, you probably wouldn't survive. Between religious authorities, political fears, and just plain awkward theology. People in the Middle Ages faced some of the most bizarre and exhausting restrictions imaginable, and yet, against all odds, they still managed to sneak around, sneak off, and sneak one in. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments below. Are you in Toronto at midnight? Are you in Manila pretending to sleep while your earbuds are in? Either way, thanks for being here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with the basic rulebook, or rather, a giant scroll of divine nope. The medieval church had a sweeping definition of sin when it came to S3x. Pretty much anything beyond a vanilla, married, man on top, woman on bottom, purely procreative act was considered suspect at best and mortally damning at worst. And even that missionary standard setup was only okay if you had zero fun doing it. Fun? Not allowed. Enjoyment was the enemy. Intent mattered too, if you happened to like it, or if it happened on the wrong day, or if your mind wandered somewhere it shouldn't mid-act, straight to hell you went. And the list of forbidden days? Oh, it was glorious in its absurdity. No sex during Lent, or Advent, or on feast days, or Sundays, or Fridays, or Saturdays in case you were preparing for Sunday. Altogether, one medieval calculation found that fewer than 100 safe days remained per year, so you're basically playing calendar roulette with your soul every time you so much as consider unbuttoning your tunic. Not that they had buttons yet, but you get the idea. This all came from a deep, tangled fear that the body was dirty and desire was dangerous. Theologians were basically obsessed with controlling lust. And then they developed tiered systems of sin, ranking sex acts like a holy leaderboard, from the tolerable missionary and marriage for procreation to the unspeakable. Everything else, including, yes, doing it from behind even with your spouse. Anal sex, utterly condemned. Oral, you'd right into the theological trash fire. Even thinking about it. Get thee to a confession booth, peasant, but the contradictions were endless. The same church that condemned all these acts also wanted everyone to be married and making babies, so long as they weren't too into it. The same church that celebrated virginity also demanded heirs. You begin to realise medieval rules about sex weren't just moral, they were political. A way to control behaviour, yes, but also a way to sort people into categories of pure and filthy, saved and damned, obedient, and dangerously human. Now let's talk about what counted as a sin. Because it wasn't just what you did, it was why you did it. Having sex to avoid cheating? That was better than lust. Having sex to have a baby? That was better than fun. Having sex because you were in love? That was suspect. Seriously, passion was a red flag. Married couples were encouraged to feel nothing. If a husband got too excited and didn't finish properly, it was a sin. If a wife enjoyed it more than her husband, also a sin. And if anyone enjoyed it while imagining someone else, well, let's just say the demons were allegedly keeping very close tabs. One theological treatise even outlined a kind of checklist for confessors. Did you have sex in an unnatural position? Was it during daylight? Was it on the wrong day? Did you finish at the same time? Yes, that was considered risky. Did you laugh during it? Oh, absolutely not. Laughter meant joy, and joy, if not tied to holy outcomes, meant doom. That's how far this went. You start to feel bad for literally everyone. Newlyweds, rural peasants, tired monks, nobody could keep up with the rules. Even the rules didn't keep up with themselves. One day theologians would debate whether sex during pregnancy was allowed. The next day, they'd argue whether sex during menstruation was a sign of witchcraft. Most regular people didn't even understand the rules, let alone obey them, but fear is a powerful motivator, especially when hellfire is on the line. Still, people got creative. Loopholes were invented, whispered between friends or passed down as grandma's secret advice. There were rituals and prayers to purify lustful thoughts. There were herbal remedies to suppress desire. Some couples even arranged confessions ahead of time, like spiritual damage control. You could almost admire the ingenuity if it weren't so grim. But here's a fun twist. The word sin itself comes from a Latin term meaning to miss the mark, and that's what so much of this feels like. Aiming at something impossible, then punishing people for missing. You're living in a time where pleasure is suspect, desire is criminalised, and your own body might just betray your soul. And yet, people still loved, flirted, joked, and very quietly found ways to be human. Historically, we know this thanks to surviving confessional guides, sermons, and penitential manuals. These documents are weirdly intimate, filled with questions that no priest should probably be asking, but also proof that people were asking and answering. One of the most famous comes from Burchard of Worms, a 10th century bishop who compiled a mega list of sins. It reads like a medieval Buzzfeed quiz from hell. Did you lie with your wife as with a dog? Did you kiss out of desire? Did you pleasure yourself with a vegetable? Yes, that's a real entry. You start to suspect that maybe the rule makers were a little too imaginative. Meanwhile, scholars today debate whether these harsh rules were really enforced or just aspirational. Did medieval priests actually ask those questions? Did people truly confess those sins? Or was the entire system more of a control fantasy, a paper maze that most people ignored? Some argue that rural communities followed their own rhythms and ignored the big rules unless a bishop came visiting. Others believe the fear of hell was strong enough to keep people anxiously compliant. In the end, the rules weren't just about sex, they were about power. Who gets to define sin? Who benefits from guilt? And who keeps track of all the broken rules when the lights go out? Because trust me, plenty of them got broken. So let's step inside the monastery walls for a moment. You're robed in rough wool, your hair tonsured, and technically you've taken a vow of chastity that's supposed to last a lifetime. You wake before dawn, chant psalms, study scriptures, eat plain food, and pray some more. From the outside, your life is disciplined, solemn, and allegedly free of sin, but inside those stone walls, another reality simmers quietly, and it's not what the church wanted written into the margins. Let's get this out of the way. Medieval monks and nuns were not uniformly sexless. In fact, the higher-ups worried about it constantly, which is the first red flag. When bishops are holding entire councils to condemn unnatural acts inside religious houses, you know something's going down, literally. Monastic rules were harsh on paper, but in practice, enforcing lifelong celibacy on thousands of people packed together and denied basic human connections turned out to be a fool's errand, especially since many didn't exactly choose the monastic life out of spiritual fervour. Some were second sons pushed into the clergy for family advancement, some were orphans, some were just unlucky girls whose dowries weren't big enough for marriage. All human, all imperfect, and very few of them managed to toe the line. Start with the nuns. Cloistered behind thick convent walls, far from the public eye, they had more freedom than you'd expect. Not enough to roam the countryside or own property freely, but enough to read, write, and form strong emotional bonds with each other. Sometimes extremely strong. Letters from nun to nun in some convents read more like love notes than spiritual encouragement. There are entire surviving manuscripts that essentially amount to centuries-old lesbian fan fiction. And while modern historians debate how physical these relationships were, it's clear that many convents functioned as intimate, closed worlds where the church's rules often stayed outside the gate. Monks were no different. The same men who illuminated gospels in gold leaf also doodled suggestive little figures in the margins. Rabbits with swords in their butts, men with outrageously exaggerated anatomy, and naked people chasing geese. Yes, geese. No one knows exactly what that meant. But it didn't come from a place of total purity. And then there's the stuff we do know for sure, like that monks sometimes snuck lovers into their cells or found opportunities with fellow brothers during moments of supposed solitude. Some monasteries were notorious enough that church authorities issued repeated angry reforms, trying to stop what was clearly a recurring issue. Spoiler, they failed. Now, if you were caught, things got serious fast. A monk caught in a sexual scandal, especially one involving another man, might be whipped, isolated, or even permanently transferred to a more remote monastery. A nun might be imprisoned in her convent indefinitely, or in severe cases, excommunicated entirely. But you notice a pattern. Those punishments were harshest when the act became public. As long as everything stayed discreet, there was wiggle room. A lot of sin was about optics. Get caught, and suddenly it was a crisis. Keep quiet, and well, God might forgive you. Eventually. Maybe. One of the strangest historical quirks is how obsessed these religious orders were with confession. which ironically meant they wrote a lot about the very sins they were trying to suppress. Some monks kept lists of temptations, not as fantasy catalogues, allegedly, but as spiritual preparation. These texts got specific, like too specific. As you read through them, you wonder if some of these confessional guides were being used more as journals than as warnings. And then there were loopholes, big ones. For example, spiritual marriages between monks and nuns. These were officially non-sexual relationships based on mutual devotion to God. But in practice, they allowed for long-term emotional and sometimes physical partnerships. Church authorities were suspicious, of course, but proving anything inside cloistered walls wasn't easy. Add in letters sent through trusted servants, secret nighttime visits, and the occasional shared theological treatise with a little too much affection, and you start to see how blurry the lines got. Even more awkward, the church itself sometimes used monasteries as political tools. Kings and lords often appointed their illegitimate sons or wayward relatives to high monastic offices. These abbot princes lived lavishly through parties and kept concubines in direct violation of their vows. But so long as the monastery produced wealth and didn't spark open scandal, few cared. The hypocrisy was so obvious that reformers like St. Bernard of Clairvaux spent half their lives begging people to take monastic vows seriously again. Spoiler, still didn't work. This wasn't just a male problem either. One case from the 14th century involved a nun named Agnes who ran away from her convent in Flanders, disguised herself as a man, and lived for years with her lover as a married couple. When discovered, she was punished, yes, but not burned or beheaded. Instead, she was gently nudged back into religious life, as if the church couldn't quite decide how serious the sin was. Gender fluidity and sexual rebellion existed in medieval cloisters long before modern categories, and as long as it didn't explode into scandal, people looked the other way. Today, scholars still argue over how widespread these behaviours were. Some suggest most monks and nuns lived quiet celibate lives, only occasionally tempted. Others believe that statistically a significant number broke their vows at some point. The lack of detailed records, mostly because nobody wanted to keep those records, makes it hard to know. But between letters, trial documents, confessions, and the graffiti scribbled into centuries-old latrine walls, it's safe to say that sexual transgression behind religious walls wasn't rare. It was just really well hidden. So here you are, inside the stone walls of supposed sanctity, watching as the very people who preach purity bend under the weight of their own desires. You can almost hear the quiet footsteps at night, the whispered prayers laced with guilt, the longing looks passed across refectory tables. Sin is supposed to stay outside, but the body inconveniently comes with you wherever you go. You're not even in bed yet, and already it feels like just existing in medieval Europe meant dodging an endless maze of moral landmines. But now let's talk about timing, because even if you somehow manage to get married, follow all the right rules, and suppress any lingering joy, the church still had another surprise for you. A calendar filled with blackout dates. That's right, there were entire stretches of the year when you simply weren't allowed to have sex, not even with your own spouse, and definitely not with a smile on your face. It all came down to purity. Specific days, weeks, and even months were marked as too sacred for sex. Lent was a big one. 40 days of fasting, praying, and abstaining from any pleasures of the flesh. That included meat, dancing, music, and yep, marital relations. But it wasn't just Lent. There was also Advent, the lead up to Christmas, which meant at least 4 more weeks off limits. Then came Rogation Days, Ember Days, Feast Days of Saints, Sundays, Down Fridays, and the night before receiving the Eucharist. One especially creative cleric calculated that out of 3 days in the year, only about 100 were technically permitted for sex. If that sounds exhausting, it was. Sex wasn't just a private thing, it was spiritual scheduling. But here's where it gets even more absurd. Even on allowed days, sex had to be done in a certain way, with the right intent, procreation, in the right position, missionary, and preferably without too much eye contact. Church authorities were so paranoid that even married couples might enjoy their duty too much that they threw down rules about posture, frequency, and even timing. Daylight sex, discouraged. Morning sex, maybe okay, but nighttime, highly suspect, especially if it felt spontaneous. And forget about it during menstruation, pregnancy, or after childbirth, all considered ritually unclean. Sex wasn't supposed to be a celebration. It was a task, a burden even. Of course, people tried to keep up. Some tracked the church calendar with painstaking detail. Others just ignored it and hoped the angels were too busy elsewhere. But the pressure was real, especially since these rules weren't just written in dusty books. They were preached from pulpits, confessed in booths, and enforced by local priests who might show up at your door unannounced. If you got pregnant during Lent, people noticed. They counted backward, they gossiped, and depending on your status, you might face public shame, penance, or worse. And then there were the days that weren't just forbidden, they were cursed. Superstitions ran thick through the medieval mindset. Some believed that conceiving a child on a holy day could result in a deformed baby or invite spiritual corruption. Others thought that sex during a lunar eclipse or on certain saint feast days could make your child into a thief or a witch. Local calendars were full of these ominous warnings, blending church teachings with leftover pagan folklore. So even when you technically had permission, there was still a chance the stars or the saints were against you. But here's where things really start to fray. Despite all this calendar madness, enforcement was wildly uneven. In big cities with more educated clergy, people might feel the squeeze of these rules more directly. In rural villages, though, life followed the rhythm of the harvest, not the liturgical calendar. A farmer with 7 kids and no priest nearby probably wasn't asking permission for Wednesday night cuddles. The reality was that many peasants lived in a kind of theological grey zone, aware of the rules but not paralysed by them. If they made it to confession once or twice a year and offered a few coins for indulgences, they figured they were probably okay, still the church didn't give up easily. Entire manuals were written to help confessors determine whether sex had occurred on forbidden days and how sinful it was. Some even advised priests to question the timing of a couple's childbearing to catch any spiritual infractions. Did you have intercourse during Lent? One guide might ask. Did you continue through the Easter Vigil? The specificity was disturbing, and you can't help but wonder how many couples simply lied to get through the interview. It wasn't just about behaviour, it was about memory, fear and control. You could confess, yes, but what you didn't confess might be held against you in the next life. Historians today are divided on how seriously people took these rules. Some argue that church control was total, that fear of hell burned hot enough to keep even young newlyweds in line. Others believe the calendar restrictions were more honoured in theory than in practice, especially among the lower classes. After all, most medieval people were illiterate. They couldn't read the church's proclamations, and they certainly weren't flipping through annual sin guides before hopping into bed. In many households, grandma's wisdom, or just plain instinct, mattered more than doctrine. But for those who did internalise the fear, the mental toll was heavy. Imagine being a newly married couple, deeply into love, and discovering you're only allowed to be intimate a handful of days each month, and only if you're both spiritually and physically pure. Imagine hearing from the pulpit that even loving your spouse too much could be dangerous, could edge too close to lust, could spark divine punishment. Sex became something to endure, not enjoy, something to fear, not cherish, and even when it was permitted, it was wrapped in so many layers of anxiety and confession that it hardly felt worth it. And yet, even with all these restrictions, people kept doing it. Babies kept being born, marriages kept forming. And somewhere between the church's rules and real life, ordinary people carved out tiny pockets of intimacy, rebellion and joy. Because at the end of the day, humans are humans. We don't run on liturgical time. We run on longing, connection, curiosity, and sometimes defiance. So you keep flipping through that absurdly crowded calendar trying to find a date that works. Not a saint's day. Not a fasting period. Not a feast. You do the math, count the holy days, look at your spouse across the room and shrug. Maybe tomorrow, if the moon's right, if you don't laugh, and if you both confess before Mass on Sunday, just in case. By now you've probably figured out that the medieval world was obsessed with regulating what went on under the covers, but here's the part that really makes your jaw clench. It's not just that the church told you when and how to have sex, it's that afterward, someone might actually ask you about it, in detail. Welcome to the medieval confessional where privacy goes to die and your soul is on the line, depending on how graphic you're willing to get. It starts innocently enough. You walk into a church, eyes low, trying to look appropriately guilty. Maybe you kneel, maybe you wait in line, maybe you eye the other sinners around you and wonder what they've done. Then it's your turn. The priest greets you in Latin, reminds you of God's mercy, and then, slowly, the questions begin. They're not vague. They are alarmingly specific. Did you have intercourse? When? Where? With whom? Was it with your spouse? Or was it for procreation? Did you both finish at the same time? Yes, that was a real concern, and here's the thing, you're not going to be totally honest, almost nobody was, because answering these questions honestly meant reliving your most private moments with someone who is judging you on behalf of the divine. You know you're supposed to tell the truth, to lay bare every filthy thought and regrettable action. But come on, this is a guy you see every Sunday who knows your family, who baptised your cousin's baby. You're not about to confess that you tried out anything you learned from that travelling troubadour's naughty ballad. Still, the church insisted on full disclosure. In fact, confession manuals were distributed across Europe, designed to help priests extract the right information. These weren't just gentle spiritual prompts. They were instruction sheets that broke sin into categories: sins of the flesh, sins of the mouth, sins of imagination. One 11th century confessor's guide has over 200 entries on sex alone. These included scenarios so obscure that you start to wonder whether the priest was asking questions or secretly compiling a bucket list. For example, had you used herbs to avoid pregnancy? Had you had sex in a church or cemetery? Had you touched yourself while thinking of your neighbour's spouse? Had you performed unnatural acts? The language is vague, but the tone is clear. If you deviated from the narrowest possible definition of procreative marital sex, you were in trouble. The priest's job was to detect every deviation, assign a proper penance, and, supposedly, help you find your way back to salvation. But realistically, it was a combination of gossip control, behavioural surveillance, and spiritual gaslighting. What you begin to see is how confessions weren't just personal, they were political. Through confession, the church gathered data. Not in the modern sense, but in the moral sense. Who was breaking the rules, how often, and with whom. It created a kind of behavioural map of society, quietly reinforcing its power over every bedroom in Christendom. And while sins like theft or lying were serious, sex sins came with an extra dose of shame. If you stole a pig, you might get community service. If you had sex during Lent, you might get a full month of daily penance, bread and water only, and mandatory abstinence for the foreseeable future. And if you enjoyed it, that could earn you even more. There's a particularly twisted irony to it all. The very people most obsessed with eradicating lust were often the ones asking the most lurid questions. Scholars still debate how these confession manuals were actually used. Were they strict scripts, loosely followed checklists, or just wishful thinking on the part of bishops who believed priests would actually ask someone if they'd sinned while riding a horse with sinful thoughts? The line between prevention and obsession gets very, very blurry. It didn't help that some confessors were themselves corrupt, lecherous, or completely overwhelmed. Records exist of priests seducing women under the guise of confession, promising lenient penance in exchange for favours. Others used what they learned in confession for blackmail or community manipulation. And some were just woefully untrained, reciting questions from their manuals like medieval telemarketers, unaware of how deeply awkward and invasive they sounded. But for the average person, confessing was both terrifying and unavoidable. The church required annual confession at minimum. More devout people might go weekly or monthly, and each time they had to dredge up their sins, rehearse them, and beg for mercy. Some carried lists in their heads, terrified they'd forget something and end up damned over a technicality. Others underreported, either out of shame or fatigue. After all, how many times can you confess the same lustful thoughts before the whole thing starts to feel like cosmic paperwork? Still, you couldn't skip it. Failing to confess a mortal sin meant you died in a state of damnation. So people dragged themselves into the booth, knelt on cold stone floors, and offered up their secrets. Some took it seriously, others just went through the motions, and some, especially those with more money or status, found ways to buy their way out of guilt altogether. Indulgences, donations, building a chapel, these could all be used to balance out the ledger. What's fascinating is that confession became both a weapon and a safety valve. For the church, it was a way to control bodies, thoughts, and behaviour. For the people, it was a chance, however slim, for spiritual relief. Even if the system was flawed, even if the questions were ridiculous, the idea that you could wipe your soul clean once a year was powerfully comforting. Especially in a world where plagues, wars, and famine made death feel constantly close. But behind every whispered admission, you sense a quiet rebellion. People confessed the sins they were ready to admit, not necessarily the ones they had committed. They learned to bend the rules, to frame their guilt in softer terms, to give just enough detail without triggering harsher penance. And priests in turn learned to read between the lines, sometimes. Other times they just followed their checklists and hoped they weren't missing anything too scandalous. So here you are, face to face with your confessor, sweating a little under your woolen hood, trying to decide how honest to be. Did you kiss your wife too passionately? Did your mind wander when she was on top, under you because no other position was allowed? Did you slip during Lent? Did you laugh? You whisper your answers. He nods solemnly, tells you your penance, and for a moment you feel lighter. You step out of the booth, eyes forward, soul slightly scrubbed. But you also know you've left a few things out. Maybe next time you'll confess those, or maybe not. By now, you've learnt that nearly every aspect of sex in the Middle Ages came with rules, suspicion and a lurking threat of eternal damnation. But one of the most persistent myths, and honestly, one of the funniest, is the idea that everyone in medieval Europe only ever had sex in one position. Man on top, woman on bottom, eyes closed, no talking, quick finish, then straight to confession. Missionary position wasn't just encouraged, it was treated as the only position that didn't risk dragging your soul directly into the flames of hell. But here's the surprise twist. That wasn't always true. It was more complicated, more debated, and yes, more hypocritical than that. Let's start with what the theologians actually said. The official line, drawn largely from thinkers like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, was that sex existed solely for reproduction. Anything that went outside that narrow path was sinful, even if it was with your legal spouse. So naturally the missionary position, never actually called that in their Middle Ages, by the way, was considered the safest bet. Man on top meant dominance, control, and alignment with natural order. Woman on top, that was chaos, reverse, heresy, side by side, suspiciously lazy, standing up, wildly dangerous. Basically, if the gravity wasn't directly involved in forcing the man's seed downward into the womb, people got nervous. But the rules weren't quite as airtight as they seemed. There were all kinds of weird debates and regional differences. Some theologians argued that variations could be tolerated if they were accidental or situational. For example, if a husband was injured and had to lie on his back while his wife took the lead, that might not be sinful so long as he didn't enjoy it. Others allowed for slight deviations in private, provided they still resulted in ejaculation inside the vagina. Anything else, any oral or anal contact, even as foreplay, was ranked as a mortal sin. But here's the real kicker. Most people didn't care. Or rather, most people didn't know. These rules existed in theological texts written in Latin, far beyond the literacy of your average goat herder or blacksmith. So while the church was busy ranking sex acts like a sanctified Yelp review, peasants were just doing what worked. That doesn't mean people were going wild. There was still social pressure, religious fear, and a deep sense of guilt embedded in medieval culture. But let's be honest, married couples were figuring it out. Manuscripts from the period include hints, jokes, and even complaints about women who tired out their husbands or men who insisted on weird experiments. Medical texts mention certain positions as ways to help conception, especially if the couple believed the woman's womb was tilted the wrong way. Yes, medieval gynecology came with a side of Kama Sutra, but it was all dressed up in clinical language. And if you were caught doing something unnatural, well, then came the drama. One bishop's manual suggests that confessors should ask if the husband had ever tried to imitate the acts of animals with his wife. This wasn't just about bestiality, that's its own mess. It was about anything that looked too carnal, too instinctive, too playful. There was a belief that imitating animals during sex reduced humans to their basest form, a kind of spiritual degradation that couldn't be easily scrubbed away with 5 Hail Marys and a week of fasting. So if your wife straddled you and you thought of a mare mounting a stallion, hellfire, friend, that's the elevator going down. But, and this is important, despite all this noise, people still did it. Even clergy. Letters from bishops scold monasteries for harbouring deviants who experimented with non-procreative acts. Rumours flew about wandering priests who gave blessings and then asked for special favours. Court records survive of couples caught in compromising positions by angry parents, landlords, or priests with too much time on their hands. And yet, despite all the finger-wagging, no one was going door to door checking how married couples aligned their bodies at bedtime. If a couple sinned privately, and no pregnancy or scandal resulted, it often just disappeared into the fog of history. What's fascinating is how some medieval doctors actually encouraged different positions. They believed that for conception to happen, both partners needed to climax. Yes, even the woman. That meant building pleasure into the act, maybe even using touch and positioning to make sure she enjoyed it. Radical, right? These texts were mostly written by men, of course, and some were hilariously misinformed. One physician claimed that women who moaned too much were likely barren. Another said that certain positions worked best for different personality types. Melancholic women needed a more vigorous approach, while choleric ones should take it slow. It's equal parts ridiculous and strangely progressive. Meanwhile, art tells its own story. You've got illuminated manuscripts with monks drawing goofy, not-so-innocent doodles in the margins, acrobatic rabbits, naked people wrestling, weird fruit-based metaphors. You've got woodcuts that show erotic scenes, sometimes hidden under flaps or painted over so they could be revealed only under the right lighting. The church tried to crack down on erotic images, especially in the later Middle Ages, but they always found a way back. Where words were censored, art snuck through. And then there's the fringe stuff. There are records, whispers really, of secret sex manuals that circulated among elite households, possibly imported from the Islamic world or classical texts rediscovered during the Renaissance. They offered illustrations, advice, and positions that made missionary look like amateur hour. Did most people ever see them? Probably not. But someone had them, and someone used them, and someone kept them from being burned. So you start to see the cracks in the church's authority. Officially, there was one right way to do it. But in private, in bedrooms and backrooms and haylofts across Europe, couples figured out what they liked, what worked, and what they could get away with. They confessed what they had to, stayed quiet about what they didn't, and learned to navigate the strange shifting line between sin and satisfaction. You picture a husband and wife in a candlelit cottage, the wind howling outside, the priest far away, and a shared understanding passing between them. Let's not ask for forgiveness for this one. And maybe they laughed. Quietly, carefully. Because laughter was still risky, you've navigated the confessional, survived the church calendar, and maybe even dabbled in some non-missionary creativity. But there's another layer to all this. Marriage. Not just the romantic ring-on-your-finger kind, but the medieval version, where legal contracts met religious oversight and love was optional. This is the part where you realise that in medieval Europe, getting married didn't just mean tying the knot. It meant entering a long-term, semi-public agreement with divine consequences, economic strings, and a heavy helping of gender politics. Oh, and the expectations around sex. They were crystal clear and completely lopsided. Let's start with the basics. Marriage in the medieval world was not built on love. It was a system of alliances, social, economic, and often political. Families arranged matches to strengthen land claims, settle debts, or just get that one annoying cousin off their hands. Consent was technically required, but don't let that fool you. If a 12-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy said yes once, even under pressure, that could be a binding marriage, even if they barely understood what they were agreeing to. The church tried to regulate this mess, insisting that both parties must consent freely, but enforcement was another story entirely. Wealth and family power often won the day. Now, once you were married, sex wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In fact, one of the core duties of marriage was marital debt, a wonderfully romantic term that basically meant you were obliged to have sex with your spouse whenever they wanted, unless you had a very good reason not to. Tired? Not an excuse. Not in the mood? Irrelevant. On a holy day? Questionable, but if your spouse insisted, you might have to pay up. For women especially, this created a legal and moral trap. You couldn't deny your husband without risking sin, or even accusations of sorcery or adultery. The church taught that denying your spouse sex could drive them into temptation, and that if your refusal led them to cheat, you bore part of the guilt. And yet marital sex wasn't supposed to be fun. The same church that expected you to fulfill your marital debt also warned against enjoying it too much. Passion was dangerous. Orgasm was fine, necessary even for procreation. But if you got too excited, if you initiated, if you asked for it when your spouse wasn't in the mood, those were red flags. Women, in particular, were expected to be passive. If a wife enjoyed sex more than her husband, she could be accused of being unnatural, lustful, even demonic. One theologian claimed that female orgasm was a minor sign of the devil's work, which is impressive logic, honestly. It gets worse, because under medieval law, wives were legally considered part of their husband's household, essentially his property. That meant no marital rape laws. If a husband forced his wife, no crime had occurred. It wasn't even considered a sin, unless it was done during forbidden times like Lent. As long as the act was procreative and occurred within marriage, it passed the church's sniff test. Women could be forced, blamed, and shamed, all while being told that it was their spiritual duty to comply. And if they didn't, they risked public penance, accusations of being a scold, or in extreme cases, being sent to a convent against their will. But of course, people pushed back. Quietly, subtly, especially women. There are records of wives strategically claiming illness, religious fasting, or ritual impurity to avoid their husbands' advances. Some pretended to be more devout than they actually were, hiding behind church rules to reclaim some bodily autonomy. Others simply made sure their confessor was sympathetic and vague. There's even evidence that some women used contraception in secret, not just to prevent pregnancy, but to avoid getting stuck in a never-ending cycle of sex and childbearing with a man they didn't like. And the husbands? Some of them weren't exactly thrilled either. The marital debt cut both ways. Wives could, in theory, demand sex too, and if the husband refused without cause, he could be considered sinful. It wasn't commons, but it happened. There's one bizarre case of a woman who took her husband to a church court for refusing to lie with her. The judge, a very tired priest by the sound of it, ruled that the man must either satisfy her or pay her to stay celibate, which was basically a medieval version of spousal support. But mostly the system favoured men. The imbalance was baked in. One thing that complicates the whole picture is how love was understood. Courtly love, the poetic, flowery, unrequited kind, was celebrated in literature but almost never practiced in marriage. Instead, it happened between married noblewomen and wandering knights, or between pages and older men. In marriage, love was a bonus, not a requirement. You could grow to care for your spouse, sure, but your first priority was obedience, fertility, and keeping up appearances. The church even advised married couples to abstain periodically, especially during holy seasons, to cleanse the soul. Some couples took this seriously, others not so much. There's a particularly wild fringe theory that says some medieval couples negotiated full abstinence within marriage, as in they chose never to consummate the relationship and lived together more like siblings. These Josephite marriages, named after Mary and Joseph, were rare but praised in certain monastic circles. To modern ears that sounds like a punishment, but to some medieval women it may have been liberation. No sex meant no pregnancy meant less danger, less pain, and less risk of dying in childbirth, which, lest we forget, was a leading cause of death for women at the time. That's the part that often gets left out when people joke about medieval marriage being backward. It wasn't just about duty and religion, it was about survival. A noblewoman might marry a man twice her age because her father needed a treaty signed. A peasant girl might wed her neighbour at 14 because he had a bigger field and 2 cows. Love had very little to do with it. And sex? Sex was tangled in expectations, risks, and power dynamics that made pleasure almost irrelevant. Still, beneath all of it, people were people. They found ways to connect, they developed feelings, they rolled their eyes at each other, made jokes, snuck in kisses when the priest wasn't looking. Some couples managed to build real affection. Some learned to love each other through routine. Some even figured out how to balance the pressure of church expectations with the reality of being alive, flawed, and deeply human. So here you are, married off at 15, handed a linen bedsheet and a string of prayers, expected to produce children while pretending that your body doesn't have preferences. And yet, maybe you do. Maybe you find small moments of rebellion in how you say no, or how you say yes. Quiet victories that go unnoticed by your priest, but not by you. Let's get into it, because now that you're officially married, lawfully entangled and contractually obligated to pay your marital dues, there's something you need to understand. Not all sex is created equal, at least not in the eyes of the church. Welcome to the medieval theology of natural law, where sex acts were not only ranked from holy to hellish, but graded like moral algebra. You thought sex was just sex? Absolutely not. Every angle, every outcome, every orifice had a value, and some of them deeply damning. At the core of this wild hierarchy was the belief that God had created a natural order to the universe, and in this grand design everything had a specific function. The sun rises, birds chirp, and the penis goes into the vagina to make a baby. That's it. That's the natural law. So anything that didn't result in procreation, anything that deviated from that sacred formula, was considered a perversion of divine intent. That meant oral sex, anal sex, mutual masturbation, spilling seed outside the womb. All of it fell under the dreaded category of sodomy. And before you ask, no, sodomy didn't only mean sex between men. It was a catch-all term for pretty much anything that wasn't straight-up procreative intercourse between a husband and wife. But here's where it gets very awkward, very quickly. Because medieval theologians weren't just condemning these acts, they were ranking them. One famous classification system, compiled in dry, joyless Latin, created an actual sliding scale of sin. Missionary with your spouse for the purpose of making babies? Still a venial sin near because you were enjoying it too much. Reverse missionary or anything considered unnatural. Mortal sin, oral sex. Mortal sin, anal sex. Extramortal sin, masturbation. Mortal sin for sure, and possibly demonic possession if you got too creative. Intercourse during menstruation or pregnancy, sinful. Intercourse during church hours, even worse. Basically, the only thing that didn't require confession was a sterile 2-minute act of duty, done in avoidance under cover of night, while thinking about how you'd rather be praying. And yet people had questions. Of course they did. Medieval life might have been brutal and short, but people were curious. They wanted to know if it counted as sin if both parties consented. What if they were trying to conceive, but it just wasn't working? What if their desires didn't match the church's expectations? What if, God forbid, it just felt good? Enter the theologians, always ready to overthink everything. They churned out volume after volume of dry commentary, full of phrases like the perversion of the seed and inversion of the vessel, all trying to split the difference between nature, pleasure, and damnation. They argued about whether ejaculation outside the vagina was worse than sex during a feast day. Some even debated whether sin occurred the moment a lustful thought crossed your mind, or only if you acted on it. Honestly, it's impressive how far they took it without ever saying the word orgasm. But wait, there's more. Because alongside this rigid framework came loopholes. Glorious, ridiculous loopholes. For example, if you had sex for pleasure but still allowed for the possibility of conception, that was less sinful than if you used contraception. If you were married but still lusting after someone else during sex, that was more sinful than lusting for your own spouse, if you were trying too hard to enjoy it. And the ultimate exception? If you had sex reluctantly to satisfy your spouse's needs, but hated every second of it, that was practically a holy act. The logic, self-sacrifice, you were taking one for the team, spiritually speaking. Now this wasn't just theory. These rankings affected your penance. Confess to having sex in a natural way during Lent. Mild scolding, maybe a week of bread and water. Confess to oral sex. Months of fasting. Confess to sodomy. Well, depending on who you were, you might be whipped, exiled, or in extreme cases, executed. And yes, some people really were punished, publicly and violently, for the way they had sex in private. Especially if you were poor, foreign, queer, or inconvenient to someone in power. Natural law wasn't just a doctrine, it was a tool, a weapon. But even here, real life kept intruding. Married couples didn't always behave according to theological flowcharts. Many of them loved each other. Many wanted to experience intimacy, not just procreation, and despite all the prohibitions, they experimented. Quietly, carefully, and sometimes with full awareness that what they were doing could land them in a confessional or worse. There are scattered, fascinating records of people caught doing things that didn't align with church teaching. Couples discovered mid-act in unnatural positions, were described in court testimony as engaging in acts not to be spoken. One court record even referred to a couple who were so frequently joined as to be indistinguishable, which is either a poetic metaphor or someone had discovered full-body contact sport. The church tried to handle all this tension by encouraging periodic abstinence. Theologians taught that taking long breaks from sex, even in marriage, was spiritually cleansing. Fasting from food? Good. Fasting from desire? Even better. Some devout couples tried to live as brother and sister, hoping for holiness through celibacy. Others abstained only during Lent or Advent. But for most people, the rules created anxiety more than virtue. You never knew if you were doing it too often, or not often enough, or in the wrong way, or while thinking the wrong thoughts. Sex became a constant moral quiz you were doomed to fail. Today, Historians argue about how much influence this natural law theory had on everyday people. Some believe most of it stayed in the ivory towers of monastic scholars. Others point to confession manuals and sermons as proof that the rules filtered down to the masses, poisoning intimacy with fear. There's no perfect answer. But one thing is clear. Even if most people didn't know the exact ranking of sexual sins, they knew that some things were worse than others, and they knew the guilt that came with stepping out of line. So here you are, lying in bed beside your spouse. The moonlight's soft through a thatched roof, and all you want is a quiet moment of connection. But in your head, you're replaying the theological scorecard. Was it procreative? Was it natural? Was it fast enough to avoid full enjoyment, but not so fast that it seemed eager? And what about that one thought? Yes, that one. You had halfway through. You sigh, roll over, and whisper a prayer. Just in case, at this point, you might be wondering, how did anyone in the Middle Ages even know if they were sinning? The answer is simple. They didn't. Not really. That's because the line between lust and love was about as clear as mud, and the church didn't exactly make it easier. In fact, they built an entire culture of anxiety around trying to distinguish whether your desire was pure or, demonic. The question wasn't just, did you have sex? It was, what were you feeling when you did it? Which, as you can imagine, turned every tingle of attraction into a theological crisis. You wake up one morning and find yourself thinking about the baker's apprentice. Strong arms, good smile, very helpful with flour sacks, and suddenly you're spiralling. Was that love? Lust? Were you admiring God's creation or sliding head first into mortal sin? The church tried to help by offering diagnostic tools, if you can believe that. Think medieval Buzzfeed quizzes, but darker. One infamous method was a sinful thought checklist offered to confessors. It asked questions like, did you gaze too long at someone with impure intention? Or did your heart beat faster without invoking God's name? Not even kidding. Your heartbeat could indict you. To further complicate things, the church insisted that intent mattered more than the act itself. Sex in marriage, fine, if it was done out of duty, not passion. A romantic poem to your spouse. Acceptable unless it stirred impure feelings. Touching your spouse's hand and feeling a flutter of warmth could be sin, could be love, could be a temptation from Satan disguised as emotional intimacy. Who knows? The only way to sort it out was confession, penance, and maybe some light self-flagellation just in case. Medieval preachers didn't help. Their sermons were filled with terrifying analogies. Love, they warned, was like fire. Controlled, it gave light. Uncontrolled, it burned the house down. Lust was a slippery serpent, always waiting at the edge of a good marriage. Even married couples were told to guard their affections carefully. If you loved your spouse too much, like the way you were supposed to love God, you were guilty of spiritual misalignment. The hierarchy was always clear. God first, spouse second, feelings a distant third, and yet people still wanted to feel something. You read old love letters from this period and they are full of yearning, confusion and theological guilt. A knight writes to a noble woman and calls her God's mirror, a way of saying, I'm obsessed with you, but please don't let me go to hell for it. A wife writes to her husband asking whether she's still pleasing in the eyes of the Lord, because they'd kissed too long the night before. A priest writes to another priest confessing his infatuation with a choir boy, and wondering if it's an angelic trial or the devil in disguise. These weren't just literary flourishes, they were real fears. People didn't know what counted, and the church liked it that way. There were, of course, official guides. One infamous text, De Amore by Andreas Capellanus, tried to explain the difference between courtly love and carnal desire. He argued that love could be noble, especially between knights and ladies, especially if it remained unconsummated, but desire? That was base. Love inspired great deeds. Lust inspired lying, cheating, and spiritual rot. But again, the line was razor thin. A kiss could be holy or sinful. A glance could be poetic or corrupt. A sigh in the wrong direction, eternal damnation. Medical theories of the time didn't help either. Based on ancient Greek humoral theory, they believed that love and lust affected your bodily fluids. Too much heat in the blood meant you were overrun with passion. Men who lusted too much were considered choleric, easily inflamed, unstable, dangerous. Women were even worse. Doctors claimed that female desire came from a wandering womb or excessive wetness. Yes, they really believed that. A woman too in love could literally lose her mind or her virtue. So if you were a woman who fell for someone, you had to wonder, is this romance or is my uterus on the move again? Even visions and dreams weren't safe. There are records of people, especially nuns, reporting dreams of angels who kissed or embraced them. These dreams were later debated by theologians. Were they divine signs, or did they reveal hidden lusts? Some saints were said to experience spiritual ecstasy, complete with descriptions that frankly sound pretty erotic. But because they occurred in a religious context, the church accepted them sometimes. For regular folks, though, good luck convincing your priest that your sexy dream was a gift from God. But here's the thing. People were incredibly clever about navigating all this. They learned to say the right things, couch their desires in religious terms, and confess just enough to avoid suspicion. A man might say, I am tempted by love, but I resist for God's sake, and everyone would nod solemnly, even if he was writing steamy poetry by candlelight. A woman might say, I honour my husband above all, while secretly longing for the troubadour who sang beneath her window last week. These weren't necessarily lies. They were survival tactics, spiritual code switching. Modern historians still debate whether medieval people actually felt the level of guilt the church was selling. Some argue that most peasants didn't internalise these doctrines too deeply. They knew the basics: don't cheat, don't sleep around, don't enjoy it too much, and left the hair splitting to monks. Others believe that confession culture seeped into everything, that even illiterate farmers worried whether their love was too strong, too passionate, too human. There's truth on both sides, but if one thing's certain, it's this. The church made sure everyone lived under a cloud of maybe. So now you're lying awake, staring at your wooden ceiling beams, trying to figure out what that feeling in your chest is. You saw her by the well today, her hair loose, her eyes warm. You didn't touch her. You didn't say it and speak, but your stomach did that stupid flip. Was that love? Lust? A test? A trap? You whisper a prayer and hope God can tell the difference, because you sure can't. Okay, deep breath, because it's time to veer sharply into the bizarre. If you've been wondering just how far medieval people took their obsession with moral purity, the answer is all the way to the barnyard. We're talking about a time when not only humans were judged for their carnal sins, but animals too. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, there were actual court trials where animals, livestock, strays, and sometimes even insects, were accused, tried, and punished for crimes of a sexual nature. Because when your worldview says sin infects everything, not even your pet goat is safe, imagine it, a dusty village square, some minor noble presiding as judge, a pig standing awkwardly in a crude wooden dock, probably snuffling for scraps. The charge? Carnal knowledge of a human. The punishment? Usually execution, sometimes with a little ceremony. These weren't jokes or community theatre, these were real legal proceedings. The medieval legal mind was obsessed with order. Every action had to have accountability, and if someone claimed they'd seen something unnatural involving a cow or a dog, that animal might be arrested, held in a makeshift cell, and tried in front of witnesses. Honestly, it's hard not to picture Monty Python sketching this with a serious face and a confused chicken. The most infamous example might be the case of a pig tried in 1386 in Falaise, France. The pig was accused of attacking and killing a child, but the trial included accusations of perverse familiarity. The pig was dressed in human clothes for the trial, possibly as a grim mockery of justice, or possibly because people truly believed it helped the court visualize the moral contamination. A judge oversaw the proceedings, evidence was presented, and the pig was found guilty. It was hanged in the town square like a criminal. There are illustrations, you wish you were making this up, and the strangeness doesn't end there. Sometimes, animals weren't the ones on trial, they were the victims. If a person was accused of engaging in sexual acts with an animal, the animal would often be brought into the court as evidence. In one Swiss case, a man accused of bestiality insisted he was innocent because the donkey had not shown fear or distress. The donkey was actually acquitted in court after multiple witnesses testified to its good character. That's right, medieval justice had donkey character witnesses. Meanwhile, the man was executed. Now, if this sounds completely unhinged to you, you're not alone. Even some medieval scholars at the time raised eyebrows at how far things were going, but others took it deadly seriously. Animals, they believed, were part of God's creation, and if corrupted by human sin, they could become complicit in evil. More than that, holding animals accountable was a symbolic way of reinforcing the moral order. If you punish a pig for sin, you're sending a message to the whole village. Evil can take any form. Nothing is immune. You start to realise something even darker. These trials were also a way to control the narrative. If a child went missing or a woman gave birth to a child out of wedlock with deformities, it was easier to blame a cursed sheep than to admit to poverty, mental illness, or social injustice. If a servant girl was caught with an animal, was she mentally ill, abused, coerced? Maybe, but none of that mattered. What mattered was restoring order, and to do that, someone or something had to take the fall. There's a fringe theory too that these trials weren't entirely about belief. Some historians argue they were a kind of ritual scapegoating. The townspeople needed catharsis. They needed a public punishment that reaffirmed their world was safe and moral and controlled, so they invented these spectacles, not out of ignorance, but out of desperation. It's less they thought the goat was guilty, and more they needed to believe something could be done. Still, it's hard to ignore that someone had to tie the noose. And yet, even among the absurdity, these trials reflected the deep-seated anxiety people had around boundaries, between human and animal, pure and impure, sacred and profane. Bestiality, after all, was one of the gravest sexual sins in medieval theology. Worse even than adultery. It was considered a crime against creation itself, a violation so disturbing it could trigger divine punishment on the entire community. That's why it didn't matter if the accused was rich or poor, though let's be honest, it was almost always poor farmers and labourers who ended up accused. A noble might be whispered about, but a shepherd caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, straight to trial, and the punishment's brutal. People found guilty of bestiality could be burned, hanged or buried alive, often alongside the animal. In some towns, if a woman was caught, she'd be drowned or stoned by her neighbours before the officials even got involved. The shame wasn't just personal, it was generational. Families changed their names, villages rewrote their histories. Everyone pretended it had never happened. But again, here's the paradox. For all the terror surrounding these accusations, they were rare. Most people weren't dragging their chickens to court. The surviving records make it seem common, but that's because bizarre things get recorded. Historians estimate only a small number of actual bestiality trials happened in medieval Europe. But their cultural weight? Immense. They functioned like urban legends, warnings whispered at night, moral horror stories meant to scare children and adults alike into staying on the righteous path. And it worked. People watched what they said. They avoided being alone in tabarns. They made sure no one could accuse them of unnatural acts, and if an animal started behaving strangely, refusing to eat or acting agitated, it wasn't just a veterinary problem, it was a spiritual crisis. You might call a priest, not a healer. You might even destroy the animal, just to be safe. So you're walking through your village, past the thatched pens and muddy courtyards, and every snort, bleat, and neigh suddenly sounds ominous. You glance at the goat. It looks back. You both know something's off, but you say nothing. You keep walking. Because in a world where morality is law and law is theatre, and theatre ends with a noose, silence is survival. Now that we've trudged through the moral minefield of sex, guilt, confession, and the occasional pig trial, let's zoom in on one of the strangest industries of medieval Europe, virginity. Not the idea of it, not the vague concept, but the actual business of proving it. You're in a world where a woman's sexual history could determine her marriageability, her dowry, her family's social standing, and in extreme cases, her survival. So people didn't just care whether a bride was a virgin, they demanded evidence. Physical, visual, and often entirely made up. Here's the setup. A nobleman marries a noblewoman, often arranged when she's still a teenager, and on the wedding night everyone, from the bride's parents to the local priest, is on edge. Not because they're worried about love. No, they're waiting for proof, and by proof we mean blood on the sheets. The idea was that if the bride was truly a virgin, her hymen would tear during intercourse, producing visible blood. So after the wedding night, the couple's bed linens might be inspected, sometimes by family members, sometimes by servants, sometimes even by the town elders, depending on how public the marriage was. No pressure. This ritual was more than awkward. It was high stakes. A bride who failed to prove her virginity could be shamed, divorced, or cast out. Her family might lose honour or financial support. There are records of annulments granted on the grounds of unproven virginity, often accompanied by snide commentary from clergy. Some husbands claim their wives opened too easily or lack the necessary resistance. And while you might assume only the rich cared about these details, even peasants gossiped about who bled properly and who didn't. Virginity wasn't just symbolic, it was a literal performance. Naturally, people found ways to fake it. One trick was the bloodied sponge, a small piece of cloth soaked in chicken blood or menstrual fluid, discreetly tucked into the bedsheets before the act. Another method involved cutting a finger and smearing the sheet afterward. In some parts of Europe, you could even hire a midwife to help stage the evidence. She'd slip into the room before the couple emerged, arrange the linens, and offer assistance if the bride had trouble producing a convincing mess. This was a whole side hustle, by the way, the medieval version of a backstage fixer. And don't think the church wasn't involved. Priests often gave lectures about the sanctity of virginity, citing the Virgin Mary as the ultimate role model. Mary wasn't just holy, she was marketed as a divine, untouched ideal, which meant all other women were being measured against an impossible standard, perfect, chaste, and somehow also motherly. Fun contradiction, right? The result was enormous pressure on girls to preserve not only their virginity, but their reputation for virginity. Even a rumour could ruin a life. There's even a weird little side note here. In some regions, it wasn't just brides who were expected to prove their purity. Grooms too might be watched. In one case from 14th century Italy, a man had to publicly display his bloody bedsheet after the wedding, not to show his bride's virginity, but to prove he was potent. No blood, no seed, no babies. He was the one shamed. So yes, sometimes the absurdity worked both ways. Still, the system overwhelmingly punished women. If you were assaulted or coerced before marriage, you might be forced to undergo invasive examinations. These exams, done by midwives or worse, male physicians, looked for signs of use. If they thought your hymen was missing or stretched, you could be declared spoiled, even if you'd been the victim of a crime. And if the examination wasn't clear, well, guess what? Your word didn't carry much weight. A nobleman could claim ignorance, innocence, or be misled by lust, and walk away with his reputation intact. You'd be labelled a liar or a temptress. It got even weirder in certain court cases. One woman accused of not being a virgin on her wedding night was forced to stand trial and offer a detailed history of her sexual activity to a panel of men. She was expected to name names, defend her anatomy, and submit to physical inspection. Another woman was proven to be innocent after she bled profusely post-wedding. Only later did her husband discover that she had paid a butcher for lamb's blood and a helpful midwife to do the rest. Was she charged with fraud? Nope. The marriage had already been consummated. Too late. Meanwhile, the idea that the hymen proves virginity? Complete myth. Modern science now tells us that hymens vary wildly in shape and elasticity. Some women bleed the first time, some don't. Some are born without hymens at all, but in the Middle Ages no one was interested in nuance. The body was a text, and if it didn't read the way society expected, it was rewritten or punished. Of course, not everyone bought into this madness. Some women used the pressure to their advantage, wielding their virginity like a bargaining chip. One noblewoman delayed marriage for over a decade, claiming she was dedicated to purity, only to reveal, later, gleefully, that she'd had 3 lovers and 2 illegitimate children. Another woman threatened to expose her new husband's own premarital flings if he ever questioned her purity again. And in peasant communities, virginity could be less about blood and more about behaviour. If you were discreet, humble and modest, people assumed the best, or at least pretended to. Still, the obsession endured. Hymens, bedsheets, wedding night blood, all of it became part of a cultural ritual that combined fear, shame, spectacle and desperation. Even art got in on it. There are medieval paintings of women holding white cloth stained red, symbols of their honour. There are poems that describe the wedding night as a test of both pleasure and purity, a contradiction that most couples probably navigated with a lot of sighing and not nearly enough candles. So here you are, wedding ring on your finger, candle flickering beside your marriage bed, and someone's hovering just outside the room waiting to see what evidence you produce. It's not about love, it's not about trust, it's about blood, or a good enough substitute. You lie back, heart pounding, your new spouse leans in, nervous, gentle, maybe even kind, but behind both of your eyes is the same question: will the sheet be read? By now, you've learned that medieval sexual morality was a tangled knot of guilt, rituals, loopholes, and linen stains. But here's a delicious little contradiction for you. While the church thundered about chastity from the pulpit, it also quietly licensed brothels. Yes, really? In many medieval towns and cities, sex work wasn't just tolerated. It was regulated, taxed, and in some cases, actively managed by local clergy. You can't make this up. Welcome to the brothel district, where salvation took a coffee break and the bishop looked the other way, unless he was collecting rent. Let's set the scene. It's the 14th century, and you've just arrived in a bustling market town like Avignon, London, or Toulouse. Somewhere behind the cathedral, down a muddy alley, or tucked beneath an archway, is the official red light zone. You'll recognise it by the bright clothing, the open windows, the women sitting casually at thresholds, maybe smoking a pipe or braiding each other's hair. It smells like beer, sweat, perfume and desperation. There are dice games in the corner, a wandering lute player with 3 chords and 0 shame, and a guy passed out in a rain barrel. Welcome to the real heartbeat of the city, where sin and commerce live side by side. The church's stance on all this was deeply uncomfortable and deeply strategic. On the one hand, theologians like Augustine claimed that sex work was a necessary evil, malum necessarium, a way to prevent worse sins like adultery, rape, or even homosexuality, which, as you know, they ranked as basically apocalyptic. On the other hand, the church had a business to run. Cities needed to keep order, and if men had no legal outlet for their desires, they might cause trouble. So rather than banning sex work outright, many towns created licensed brothels under strict guidelines. Some of these even had official managers, often widows, who were responsible for collecting fees, preventing fights, and reporting disorderly clients to the city watch. Here's where it gets especially hypocritical. In some cases, the church owned the buildings that housed brothels. Rents were collected, taxes were paid, and everyone looked the other way, as long as the arrangement stayed discreet. In Toulouse, for example, the bishop's estate included properties in the city's red light quarter. In London, the Bishop of Winchester operated brothels so famously that the prostitutes became known as Winchester geese. Yep, you could literally say the bishop's geese were honking after dark. Of course, this system came with conditions. Women working in licensed brothels had to register with city authorities, often wearing identifiable clothing. A sash, a veil, or a particular colour like yellow to mark them as sex workers. They paid regular fees, followed curfews, and submitted to occasional health inspections by city-appointed midwives. Some towns even banned them from working on Sundays or during religious festivals, because nothing kills the mood like a looming saint's day. And if they got caught breaking the rules, working outside the designated area, soliciting a priest or refusing to pay their fees, they could be whipped, jailed, or expelled from the city. But life inside the brothel wasn't all taxes and restrictions. There was laughter, camaraderie, and survival. Women banded together to protect one another from violent clients. They shared tips, food, even clothes with lovers outside the business, hoping for marriage or at least someone to bring bread home. Others had children, raised them together, and taught them to avoid the same path. It was gritty, dangerous, and deeply human. And here's the real kicker. Despite being treated as morally inferior, sex workers were often far better informed about anatomy, birth control and sexual technique than the average noble bride. They knew what plants could prevent pregnancy. Pennyroyal, rue and Queen Anne's lace were popular. How to deal with infections and how to handle drunk clients with minimal drama. Some even served as informal therapists, listening to men vent about their marriages, their sins, their fears of damnation. It was transactional, yes, but also intimate, in a way few medieval relationships were allowed to be. Of course, there were still dangers. Sex workers were frequently scapegoated during outbreaks of disease, especially the plague. Rumours swirled that they carried corruption, that their bodies were vessels of divine punishment. During moral panics, they were among the first to be rounded up, whipped publicly, or driven out of town. And while some cities protected registered workers, unlicensed ones, often the poorest or most marginalised, had no recourse at all. They lived on the edge of the law, the edge of society, and often the edge of starvation. There's one fringe theory that's especially intriguing. Some historians believe that brothels played a quiet role in resisting church control. Not openly, but through the sheer act of carving out space for pleasure, autonomy, and unregulated intimacy. In a world where women's bodies were constantly monitored, the brothel became one of the few places a woman might, however briefly, control the terms of engagement. Was it empowering? Not exactly, but it was a sliver of independence in a world that offered very little. And the clients? Oh, they were everyone. Farmers, merchants, students, clergy, especially clergy. There are so many complaints about priests visiting brothels that it became a running joke in medieval satire. One poem describes a friar who preaches about sin in the morning and spends his nights in the company of sweet sisters of the silk sheets. Another recounts a bishop who assigned penance to a brothel owner on one hand, then slept with her on the other. Hypocrisy wasn't just a bug in the system, it was the system. But even with all its contradictions, the existence of regulated brothels revealed a truth the church rarely acknowledged. People need connection. They need touch, conversation, escape. The brothel wasn't just a site of sin, it was a pressure valve, a confessional of flesh, where shame took a break and desire got a seat at the table. It may not have been holy, but it was real. So you're walking home after Vespers with a cloak wrapped tightly, the bells still echoing in the distance. You pass through the city gate and hear laughter. High, low, unrestrained. Somewhere in the red-lit alleyways, life is unfolding in all its messy, sensual, contradictory glory. And for a moment, you wonder, if everyone's so terrified of sin, why does the laughter sound so free? So far, we've tiptoed through the sanctioned chaos of medieval bedrooms, brothels, and confessionals, but now we're heading into even more controversial territory, gender. Or more accurately, what happened when you didn't fit the medieval gender binary. Because here's the uncomfortable truth the Church and Crown couldn't quite wrap their sanctified heads around. Some people in the Middle Ages didn't play by the man-woman rulebook, and when they didn't, the rules got murky, the accusations got loud, and every robe, tunic, or boot suddenly mattered way more than it should have. Let's start with cross-dressing. For most medieval folks, clothing wasn't just fabric, it was identity. Your tunic, viz. Or veil, or belt, or shoes told people who you were, what gender you claimed, what status you held, and quite literally, what you were allowed to do. A man in a woman's gown or a woman in a man's boots. That wasn't just fashion, that was defiance. In many places, it was considered a sin and a crime. Theologians called it a form of deception, a violation of natural order, and some even argued it invited demonic influence, which, yes, sounds extreme, but this is the same worldview that thought left-handedness was a sign of Satan. The Church especially hated when women dressed like men. The Bible's Deuteronomy 22:5 was quoted constantly. "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, for all who do so are an abomination." And abomination was never just a metaphor. In court records, women caught wearing men's clothes could be arrested, fined, forced to do public penance, or worse. In some places they were shaved bald and paraded through town in humiliation processions. The act of cross-dressing was seen as trying to usurp male authority, a threat to the God-given hierarchy of man above woman, because God forbid a woman put on pants and suddenly start thinking. But what about men dressing as women? Same judgment, even more fear. A man in feminine clothes was seen as degrading his masculine status, an affront to God's design. Sometimes this came with an extra dose of gay panic. The assumption was that a man dressing femininely was trying to seduce other men, or that he was making himself soft in body and spirit. It wasn't just confusing, it was dangerous. If accused of sodomy and cross-dressing, a man could be tried, punished, and even executed, especially during periods of moral crackdown. And yet, people still did it. Sometimes for survival, sometimes for love, sometimes for reasons that don't fit neatly into our modern categories. Take Eleanor Rykenair, for instance. In 1395 London, Eleanor, a trans woman, likely assigned male at birth, was arrested for sex work while wearing women's clothing. In court documents, she's referred to by both male and female names, and her testimony is full of carefully worded truths and artful dodges. She describes sleeping with men, being treated as a woman, and navigating her life with a delicate balance of visibility and discretion. What's remarkable is that the records don't read like a scandalous exposé. They read like confusion. Officials didn't know what to do with her, so they let her go. There were others. Joan of Arc, famously burned at the stake in 1431, was accused not only of heresy but of wearing men's clothing. Her armour, tunic and cropped hair became part of the case against her. She argued it was for safety, to protect her identity and physical body while riding with troops, but her enemies saw it as rebellion. an unnatural woman, a defier of roles. And even though her military success was unmatched, it was her outfit that sealed her fate. In some communities, though, gender fluidity found quiet places to survive. Female saints who disguised themselves as men to enter monasteries were venerated. Their stories were told with admiration until the cross-dressing was discovered, at which point it was spiritualized. She did it for God, they'd say, and retroactively blessed the whole charade. These tales became cautionary but also aspirational. They acknowledged that sometimes stepping outside gender norms was the only way to access power, education, or spiritual freedom. And for some people, cross-dressing wasn't just about safety or deception. It was identity. They didn't feel aligned with the roles the church assigned them. There are scattered letters and personal notes describing people who felt more comfortable in clothing that didn't match their assigned gender. They didn't have modern language for it. No terms like transgender or non-binary, but the experience was there, the struggle was real, and the consequences could be fatal. Interestingly, some scholars now argue that the rigid binary of male-female in the Middle Ages was more flexible than we assume. Medieval medicine believed that all bodies existed on a spectrum. Women were just cooler, wetter versions of men, and in theory one could transform into the other under extreme conditions. There were myths of women becoming men after seeing battle, or men becoming women through divine punishment. These weren't seen as affirming stories, but they were part of the medieval imagination, and that space, however awkward, left a crack in the wall. Still, the cultural reaction was usually fear. Cross-dressing disrupted everything: inheritance rights, marriage rules, social hierarchies. A woman dressing like a man could gain access to education or property. A man dressing like a woman could escape military service. These weren't just personal choices, they were political acts, and the church, obsessed with hierarchy, couldn't tolerate ambiguity. Which leads us to a strange contradiction. While gender rules were harshly policed, they were also, in practice, frequently subverted. Travelling performers cross-dressed for entertainment. Some servants swapped clothes with their masters for fun or mischief. At festivals, gender roles were inverted as part of the chaos. Men wore dresses, women carried swords, and no one got burned for it, as long as they changed back by morning. So here you are, adjusting your tunic, feeling the itchy fabric against your skin, knowing that you don't quite fit into the role you were assigned. You pass a mirror, or maybe just your reflection in a bucket of water, and wonder what it would be like to wear what feels right. Not what keeps you safe, not what pleases the priest, but what aligns with who you are. And in that moment, brief and fragile, you imagine a world where that choice wouldn't damn you. Then the bell tolls. Time for mass. You pull the veil back over your hair, or you straighten the cloak, or you bind your chest a little tighter. Just for today, just for now. So after all this sin management, guilt calculus, and brothel-based moral detours, you might be wondering, how did medieval people handle the risk of pregnancy? And better yet, how did they avoid it? Because let's be honest, nothing cuts through a secret tryst or a romantic rebellion faster than the possibility of a surprise baby, especially in a world where childbirth was as risky as battle. And having a child out of wedlock could brand you socially radioactive. And while modern birth control wasn't a thing yet, no latex, no pills, no convenient apps, people still got creative. Welcome to the quiet world of cloaks and lies, medieval contraception. Let's be clear from the start. The church officially condemned any effort to prevent pregnancy. Full stop. The prevailing doctrine said sex must be open to life at all times. So any form of contraception, from herbal to behavioural, was considered a direct defiance of God's plan. It didn't matter if you were a peasant trying to feed your existing 7 kids or a noblewoman terrified of dying in childbirth. Again, avoiding conception was sin, and yet people absolutely did it. Not just peasants in the shadows, wealthy women, educated clerics, and yes, even married couples who really didn't want a 12th child. So how did they pull it off? Start with the herbal root. Medieval women had an astonishing amount of plant knowledge, passed down through midwives, older relatives, and the kind of whispered conversations that happen when the men leave the room. Certain herbs were believed to suppress fertility, either by reducing libido, preventing implantation, or causing early miscarriage. Pennyroyal, rue, Queen Anne's lace, and wild carrot seeds were among the most commonly used. They were brewed into teas, crushed into powders, or steeped in wine. Some women wore small bundles of these herbs around their waists or necks, little sachets of protection against the unpredictable world of medieval sex. Now, were these remedies effective? In some cases, yes, particularly Queen Anne's lace, which contains compounds that may interfere with progesterone. But it was risky, dosages were inconsistent, recipes were approximate, and side effects ranged from mild cramping to accidental poisoning. Still, when your other option was dying in childbirth or being cast out as a fallen woman, a little experimentation with kitchen herbs felt worth it. Then there were the physical methods. Condoms in the modern sense didn't exist, but there were proto-versions. Animal bladder sheaths, washed, softened and tied at the base, were sometimes used, primarily to prevent disease but occasionally for birth control. The problem? They were expensive, awkward, and definitely not mood-enhancing. Most people didn't bother. Instead, couples relied on withdrawal, famously unreliable, but better than nothing. Postcoital rituals like squatting and sneezing, yes, seriously, or simply tracking the moon. Some women believed fertility rose and fell with lunar cycles and timed sex accordingly. It wasn't exactly science, but it beat crossing your fingers and hoping God was too busy to notice. And here's where things get extra medieval. Some advice was just weird. One 12th century text advised women to jump backwards 7 times immediately after intercourse. Another recommended a mixture of ground pepper and honey inserted with a cloth before the man lays with thee. There were also spells, invocations to saints or spirits, charms worn on the thigh, even whispered prayers timed to the rhythm of sex. Did they work? Probably not. But they provided a sense of control in a world where most women had very little. The Church, of course, condemned all of this. Contraception was lumped into the same category as sorcery, heresy, and sexual deviance. If you were caught promoting or practicing birth control, you could be excommunicated, tried for witchcraft, or, if things got especially dark, burned. The logic was that preventing life was an affront to God's will. It made you a murderer before a soul had even entered the world. Never mind the fact that God, apparently, was fine with you bleeding out during childbirth or being too poor to feed your children. His will was only sacred when it lined up with the birth rate. Still, enforcement was spotty. As with most things, the rules hit the poor hardest. Wealthy women could afford discretion. They had midwives loyal to the household, servants to run errands, and husbands who might turn a blind eye if it meant fewer heirs to divide the estate among. Poor women, not so lucky. If you were a farmer's daughter caught brewing pennyroyal tea, you might get a scolding, a penance, or a ruined reputation. If you were caught selling it, things got worse. You might be accused of witchcraft, especially if one of your clients miscarried, and someone decided it was your fault. It was a delicate balance between healing and heresy, between survival and sin. Interestingly, some church officials were more lenient behind closed doors. Certain confessors understood the danger of constant childbirth and quietly recommended periodic abstinence as a workaround. They'd never call it birth control, but they'd advise women to pray for strength to resist carnal temptation, which in practice meant fewer pregnancies. Others turned a blind eye altogether, especially in rural areas where enforcement was nearly impossible. And then there were those rare, radical thinkers who suggested that maybe, just maybe, a woman's body should belong to her. They didn't last long in the hierarchy. There's one especially odd case from 13th century Italy. A woman named Agnese was put on trial not for contraception, but for teaching other women how to avoid pregnancy. Her crime? Not the act itself, but sharing knowledge. She claimed her methods were a gift from the Virgin Mary, and her defence was that preventing unwanted pregnancies allowed women to serve God more fully. The court didn't buy it. She was convicted of improper interference with divine intent and banned from midwifery. Her clients kept coming anyway. Modern scholars still debate how common contraception really was in the Middle Ages. Some believe it was rare and ineffective, others argue it was widespread, just invisible, hidden behind euphemisms, lost in the margins of recipe books, buried in oral tradition. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. It was dangerous, discouraged, and often improvised, but it happened. Because women, even in the most repressive societies, have always found ways to manage their bodies, often quietly, always creatively. So here you are, sitting in your candlelit kitchen, pretending to grind spices for a stew. But really, you're preparing something else. A bitter tea, a poultice, a little cloth bundle for a friend who's too scared to ask out loud. You don't talk about it, not even to your sister. But you know what you're doing, and you know why, because the church can write whatever it wants in its books. But you've got your own recipe. By now, you've seen how tangled, contradictory and performative medieval sex rules were, but some areas of sin got extra attention, and by extra we mean entire volumes written in rage-coloured Latin, laws shaped in paranoia, and punishments that would make your stomach lurch. Chief among these, sodomy. The term wasn't just a narrow reference to male-male sex, it was a theological junk drawer for anything the church decided was against nature. But in practice, when the word came up in sermons or courtrooms, it almost always pointed to men having sex with other men, and what followed was fear, surveillance, and a long campaign to scapegoat those who broke the most taboo of the rules. Let's define it first, at least the way medieval people tried to. Sodomy was borrowed from the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities supposedly destroyed for their sexual immorality. Over time, theologians and canon lawyers used the term to cover everything from oral sex and anal sex, with anyone, to masturbation and even excessive heterosexual passion. But male-male sex, that was the obsession. It was considered the pinnacle of unnatural vice, a sin so grievous it could supposedly trigger divine wrath not just on the sinner, but on entire cities. Earthquakes, plagues, crop failures, they could all be interpreted as God's response to a few men loving each other too much, or in the wrong way, or both. The church and secular authorities didn't stop at moral condemnation. Laws were written, courts were assembled, punishments were invented specifically to be public and terrifying. In many parts of Europe, sodomy was punishable by death, usually by burning. Lesser punishments included exile, castration or flogging depending on the circumstances and how much the judge hated you. In some cities like Florence, entire squads of officials were assigned to investigate accusations of sodomy, often based on anonymous tips, rumours or jealous lovers. You could be arrested without warning, questioned under torture, and sentenced with little evidence beyond hearsay. It was the Inquisition, but make it personal, and yet, here's the strange part, it was everywhere. Because for all the fear, same-sex relationships between men were a real, visible part of medieval life. Especially in urban centres, in universities, and within monastic communities, relationships between men ranged from deeply emotional to clearly physical. Some were hidden, some weren't. In places like Florence, records from the Office of the Knight, a 15th century moral police force, list thousands of cases of suspected sodomy. Most did not lead to punishment, but they paint a vivid picture of a city where men flirted, touched, kissed, and occasionally got caught. Monasteries were another hotbed, not because they were inherently depraved, but because they were filled with men living together, often isolated from women, and encouraged to form intense spiritual bonds with one another. Some of those bonds crossed lines, some didn't. But the boundary between brotherly love and suspicious affection was blurry. Letters survive from monks who write in flowery, intimate language to one another, sometimes towing the line between holy and horny so hard you wonder how the ink didn't catch fire. One famous monk described his affection for a fellow brother as a fire in my soul that stirs my loins, which, okay, that's not just about psalms. The church's response? Mixed. On the one hand, they punished sodomy harshly, especially when it became public. On the other, they knew it was widespread and often chose to ignore it. As long as things stayed quiet, subtle, and didn't embarrass anyone too important, priests and monks might look the other way. Some even participated. The contradiction was staggering. Love between men could be sacred, so long as it wasn't sexual, or at least so long as no one admitted that it was. But not everyone kept quiet. There were medieval thinkers who spoke openly about same-sex desire, not to celebrate it, but to catalogue and condemn it in exhausting detail. Thomas Aquinas, for example, placed sodomy second only to murder in his hierarchy of sins. Other writers described it as worse than bestiality because it corrupted God's design for human bodies. In one particularly dramatic tract, an English cleric blamed a famine on the spread of sodomy in the monasteries. The idea was always the same. This wasn't just a personal failing, it was cosmic disorder. And to restore the balance, someone had to burn. And yet for all the posturing, same-sex relationships kept happening. Sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly. And sometimes with surprising levels of social tolerance. In certain cities, especially those with large university populations or merchant classes, Men formed quasi-romantic partnerships that everyone kind of accepted. Maybe it was because they were wealthy, maybe it was because they donated to the church, maybe it was because they were discreet enough and society had bigger problems than chasing down every kiss exchanged behind a tavern. Whatever the reason, the fear of sodomy existed alongside a muted tolerance, a dangerous coexistence. Now, women, that's where things get even weirder. Female same-sex relationships were largely invisible to medieval law, not because they didn't exist, but because most male lawmakers couldn't imagine what two women could possibly do together that counted as real sex. Some church authorities argued that women who slept together were guilty of spiritual confusion or mirroring sin, but very few were prosecuted. There were exceptions. If a woman used a dildo, or what the records call a false member, she could be charged with sodomy. But two women kissing, cuddling, or engaging in mutual pleasure, that often went unnoticed, or was dismissed as silly play acting, which in its own twisted way gave lesbian relationships a shadowy kind of protection. Of course, that didn't mean women who loved women had it easy. They could still be shamed, exiled, or punished if their relationship became too visible. And if one of them dressed like a man, that's when the hammer dropped. Cross-dressing, as we've seen, was often the detail that triggered legal action. Not the love, not even the sex, but the clothing. Because once again, the real crime was breaking the script. So here you are, walking the narrow streets of Florence after dark, your cloak pulled tight, your eyes meeting someone else's across the square. Just for a second, a shared look, a flicker of recognition. The danger is real, but so is the draw. And in that moment, all the sermons, laws, and punishments fade into the background. Because the desire doesn't vanish, it never did. It just moved into the shadows. If you've stuck with this long enough, you've probably noticed a pattern. No matter how severe the rules, no matter how absurd the taboos, people in the Middle Ages kept doing what they weren't supposed to. But here's the brilliant twist in the church's entire sex sin system. It actually left room for repeat offenders. It wasn't just about purity or punishment, it was about management. And nothing embodied that delicate balance between sin and control like penance. In fact, you could almost say the whole medieval sex game came with a built-in reset button. As long as you confessed properly, paid your dues, and didn't enjoy yourself too much in the meantime. Let's say you've committed a sin, a real one. Maybe you had sex with someone during Lent. Or worse, you initiated. Or worse than worse, you enjoyed it. You're not going to hell yet, though, because the church gives you an out. Confession. Go to your priest, admit your misdeed, show some remorse, and you'll be assigned a penance. Think of it as divine community service. A little fasting here, a few prayers there, maybe a pilgrimage if things got really spicy. Then, ta-da, your sin is forgiven, your soul is back to neutral, and you're free to mess it all up again next week. Rinse and repeat. This wasn't a loophole, it was the design. The church knew that people were going to break the rules, so they built a spiritual accounting system to track the damage. The idea came from early Christianity, but really hit its stride in the medieval period, when confession became mandatory and penance turned into a whole cottage industry. There were manuals, huge ones, listing specific sins and their corresponding punishments. Masturbated once, say 5 Our Fathers, had sex with your spouse in an unapproved position, fast for 3 days, committed sodomy. Now we're talking months of prayer, fasting, and possibly public shame. The genius and the horror of this system was that it treated sin like a math problem. Every act had a weight, every confession had a cost, and as long as you paid your spiritual debt, you could keep your spot in the divine ledger. The result? People started sinning with strategy. They didn't necessarily avoid sex, they just made sure to space out their confessions, confess selectively, or plan ahead. Want to sleep with your lover during Advent? Fine. But be ready to do double penance before Easter. Can't stop fantasizing about your neighbour's wife, just confess weekly and throw in an extra rosary or two. The whole thing became a rhythm: sin, confess, cleanse, repeat. And here's the truly absurd part. The more the system matured, the more detailed it got. Penance manuals began offering discounts for circumstances. Had sex on a feast day? That's bad. But if it was an accident, like you forgot it was St. Bartholomew's Eve, maybe you only fast half the usual time, was your partner your spouse? Then the sin was lesser, even if the act was forbidden. Were you drunk? Slight mitigation. Were you a noble? Or maybe you can pay for your penance instead of actually doing it. Yes, that's right. Money enters the scene. Indulgences. You could buy spiritual forgiveness, literally. Donate to the church, sponsor a pilgrimage, build a chapel to and suddenly your soul was sparkling clean. This was the high-stakes version of penance, often reserved for the wealthy or politically connected. Couldn't fast for a week, just hand over a few coins and let some monks starve on your behalf. Feeling particularly sinful? There were pre-written indulgences available at certain shrines, offering generic forgiveness for a list of common transgressions. In the late medieval period, indulgences were sold so aggressively that reformers like Martin Luther eventually said, "Okay, absolutely not." But that's a story for another bedtime. Of course, not everyone gamed the system. Plenty of people took penance seriously, deeply, emotionally, with real guilt and fear. Some flagellated themselves in public, walking barefoot for miles in snow, bleeding as they chanted prayers. Others entered monasteries as lay brothers to work off their sins in silence. There are records of men voluntarily living in isolation for years because they believed they were too corrupt to rejoin society. But for every extreme case, there were 5 others muttering their Hail Marys with crossed fingers and a side glance toward the nearest tavern. The church wasn't always thrilled about this predictability. Some theologians warned that easy penance made sin too convenient. Are we creating repeat offenders? They wondered. Maybe not in those exact words. But the truth is, the church needed sinners. A perfect population wouldn't need priests, confession, indulgences or penance. So while they preached hellfire from the pulpit, they quietly kept the system going. Because it worked. Because people feared eternal damnation, but only if they didn't confess in time. There's a fringe theory among some modern scholars that confession and penance became a form of social control so efficient it bordered on psychological conditioning. You sin, you feel guilt, you confess, and you get temporary relief. Then the cycle starts again. You're never truly free, you're just temporarily safe. It's not a moral system so much as a behavioural trap, kind of like a medieval Fitbit for your soul. You've completed 10,000 sins this week. Time to confess or face the abyss. And it wasn't just individuals. Entire communities would engage in collective penance, especially after disasters. Drought? Time to whip ourselves in the street. Famine? Clearly someone's been having too much non-missionary fun. Disease outbreak. God is mad. Everyone confess, then fast, then pray, until it rains or the rats stop biting. The idea was that even unspoken sins poisoned the whole group. So if one person broke the rules, everyone suffered unless the ledger got balanced. So here you are, kneeling in the back of a dim chapel, the priest already halfway through the Lord's Prayer, and you're mentally sorting through your sins like a checklist. That one time with your spouse under the stars, was that on a forbidden night? And did you confess last week or the week before? Was that dream about the miller's son technically a sin, or just an overactive imagination? You lower your eyes, whisper the first few words of your confession, and hope the math still works. After all, the sin may be old, but the penance, it always starts fresh. By now you're probably starting to feel like medieval sex wasn't about sex at all. It was about control, performance, fear, ritual and sin, and the same went for love. Because if you're picturing star-crossed lovers sneaking kisses in candle-lit corners, or husbands writing tender letters to their wives while out at war, think again. The real romantic drama of the Middle Ages wasn't found in marriage at all. It was in the poetry-swapping, lute-playing, heart-sighing madness known as courtly love, and it was almost always aimed at someone you were never supposed to touch, especially if she was already married, especially if he was another knight, and especially if your affection made absolutely no logical sense. So here's how it worked. Courtly love, Finnemore in its original Occitan form, was an elaborate game of emotional longing that flourished among the European nobility, especially from the 12th century onward. It wasn't about starting families or honouring God's design, it was about forbidden desire, about yearning, about placing someone, usually a married noblewoman, on a pedestal so high she might as well have been floating somewhere above the cathedral bell tower. You didn't confess your love to her directly. Oh no, you wrote poems, you composed songs, you challenged other knights to duels just to carry her ribbon on your sword. It was equal parts performance art, emotional torture, and oddly passive-aggressive warfare. The whole system sprang up around the same time as the chivalric code, when knights were expected to be brave, noble, and emotionally restrained. So what better way to demonstrate your inner turmoil than by falling in love with someone completely off limits and then refusing to act on it? These were not relationships grounded in reality. A knight might spend years pining after a lady he barely spoke to. He'd describe her ivory skin and rose lips in excruciating detail, while never once referencing her actual name. And she might glance his way at a feast, or pass him a token before battle, but that was it. Anything more would ruin the fantasy, and yes, you read that right, this was supposed to be unfulfilled. If courtly love ever turned physical, it had lost its magic. The longing was the point. Passion kept just out of reach was considered more noble, more pure than actual intimacy. The goal wasn't consummation, it was devotion. To worship from afar, to burn silently. To swear loyalty to someone who might not even know you existed. It sounds tragic, sure, but it also gave people an outlet. In a society where marriages were usually arranged for political or economic reasons, courtly love let you feel something even if it wasn't with your spouse, especially because it wasn't with your spouse. This kind of emotional affair, dressed up in poetry and music, became a way to experience romantic yearning without threatening the structure of marriage. Technically. Of course, some people crossed the line. We know this because scandal followed the genre wherever it spread. Kings and lords who fell too hard for their muses often ended up in hot water. Knights accused of seducing the lady of the manor while her husband was off crusading. Women accused of encouraging attention through their own poetry, as if inspiration itself was a moral failing. And the church, it hated all of this. Passion, even unfulfilled, was a problem. Lust in the mind was just as dangerous as lust in the flesh. Even worse, courtly love often put a human beloved above God, turning her into a sort of earthly idol. Theologians preached against it constantly, warning that loving a woman more than the Virgin Mary would lead to damnation. Maybe not in this life, but definitely in the next. Still, it was impossible to stop. Troubadours roamed from court to court, spreading the gospel of heartbreak. Their songs were catchy, dramatic, and just self-pitying enough to make noblemen feel deep. She looked at me once, one might sing, and I burned for 12 seasons, or her scarf fell upon the ground, and I have not known peace since. It was emo before emo existed, and not all of it stayed heteronormative either. While most surviving poems are from men to women, there are scattered records of knights composing verses to each other, sometimes jokingly, sometimes seriously, sometimes in that very medieval space where intense male friendship, religious brotherhood, and romantic longing blurred together like wine spilled on parchment. Was it love, lust, loyalty? Historians still argue about it, but the emotions were real, the yearning was real, and in some rare but documented cases, the relationships were too. Meanwhile, some women played the game right back. Certain noble women became famous for their own poetry, clever, cutting, and just as emotionally loaded as anything the men were writing. They mocked knights for their dramatics, flipped the roles, praised female beauty, and occasionally dropped not-so-subtle hints that their affections weren't exactly confined to their husbands. One Occitan Trobaritz, female troubadour, wrote, "He says he loves me, yet never listens. I would rather have the touch of her hand than his 1,000 hollow songs." Oof. But don't get too starry-eyed. For all its poetry, courtly love still operated in a patriarchal, class-based society. The woman was idealised, sure, but also objectified. She was a trophy, a muse, a symbol, rarely an agent, rarely an equal, and heaven forbid she reciprocated in a way that challenged her role. A man who fell in love with a noble woman was a romantic. A noble woman who acted on her feelings? A whore. The double standard was baked into the fantasy. And yet people kept playing the game, because it was a game and it made life bearable. A knight returning from war might be bruised, bloody, and emotionally wrecked. But if he carried a lady's token, if he had her scarf tucked under his armour, he could tell himself he was fighting for love, not just politics. A woman married off at 14 to a man twice her age might hate the reality of her life. But if she had a secret poem hidden in her prayer book, written by someone who called her radiance carved in silk, that poem could sustain her, even if the man who wrote it had long since married someone else, even if he never meant a word. So here you are, sitting under a balcony at her dusk, strumming a borrowed lute and hoping she's listening through the shutters. Or maybe you're holding the parchment, your fingers tracing a line that says, "I am yours, though I can never be yours." You'll never kiss, never hold hands, never dance, but for now, that feeling, huge, stupid, impossible, is the most alive you've ever felt. And in a world where almost everything else is choreographed, this This is your secret rebellion. By now, you've heard the name often enough that she's probably floating in your subconscious like a glowing blue icon in a stained glass window. The Virgin Mary. She hovers silently over every medieval village, every cathedral arch, every prayer muttered in the dark after someone did something they're not supposed to. She's more than just a religious figure. She's the ideal, the blueprint, the silent measuring stick against which all women, knowingly or not, are judged. And if that sounds suffocating, well, it was. Let's start with how Mary became the woman. By the 12th century, her image had ballooned into near mythic perfection. She was simultaneously virgin and mother, queen and servant, above all women and yet the ideal woman. She gives birth without pleasure, without pain, and definitely without sex. She's untouched by original sin. She's docile, pure, eternally obedient, and always dressed like a walking devotional pamphlet. Theological debates didn't just celebrate her, they obsessed over her. Was she ever tempted? Could she have sinned if she wanted to? Did she even have a normal human anatomy? There were entire church councils debating whether Mary lactated like other mothers, or if her breast milk came directly from heaven, metaphorically flavoured with grace. Now picture being a regular woman living under this celestial standard. You're a blacksmith's wife, or a tenant farmer's daughter. You menstruate, you get tired, you sometimes swear when your ox dies, and you occasionally think about the baker's son's jawline when you should be thinking about your husband. You love your children, but childbirth nearly killed you. Twice. And every time you look up at the cathedral mural, there's Mary glowing, bloodless, impossibly calm, staring down like a cosmic reminder that you are, by comparison, gross. This ideal didn't stay trapped in art, it infected everything. Preachers praised Mary's purity while berating the lustful nature of ordinary women. Mothers were told to emulate her. Wives were encouraged to behave as Mary would, meaning no backtalk, no complaints, and definitely no initiating sex. Virginity became the highest feminine virtue. Not intelligence, not kindness, not even faith, but virginity. And Mary was the eternal virgin, even after childbirth, even after breastfeeding the Son of God, because apparently the church believed in miracles and tight pelvic floors. This isn't to say Mary herself was hated. Far from it. She was beloved, almost to the point of overshadowing Jesus in some regions. People prayed to her for protection, fertility, safe childbirth, and mercy in ways they didn't dare address God directly. She was the divine mother everyone wanted, endlessly patient, forgiving, and accessible, but that love came with strings. Because if Mary was the ideal, then every woman had to try, futilely, to live up to her. And failure wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. There's a particularly uncomfortable theological term that sums up this tension: Mariolatry. It's what some later reformers used to describe the excessive, almost worshipful obsession with Mary. Because by the 13th and 14th centuries, she wasn't just honoured, she was used. Used to shame, to control, to remind every woman that sex was dirty unless it produced a saviour, and even then, only if it happened without actual intercourse. No pressure, ladies. Meanwhile, actual women were getting burned alive for much less. If you were too sexual, too loud, too independent, you were a Jezebel, a Lilith, a temptress dragging men toward damnation. Mary was placed on a pedestal so high that the only options left for living women were sinner or saint, and the saint role was taken. Women who didn't marry were supposed to become nuns. Women who didn't want children were considered unnatural. Women who wanted sex, don't even try it. There's a 14th century priest who wrote an entire sermon warning women not to greet their husbands too warmly, lest they be confused for harlots. You can imagine how that went over in the average medieval bedroom. This impossible dichotomy between Mary the Eternal Virgin and real, flawed human women created emotional chaos. Some women internalized it. They felt guilty for their desires, for their bodies, even for loving their husbands too much. Others tried to rebel quietly through subversive prayers or secret sexual practices. Still others embraced the only path that made sense and entered convents, where at least the rules were clear and the pressure to reproduce was off the table. But here's the strange twist. For all her inaccessibility, Mary also became a source of comfort. Because while male saints and God himself were often portrayed as angry or stern, Mary was the soft place to land, the intercessor, the mother figure who might understand why you couldn't always live up to her. She became the patron of women in labour, of widows, of girls too afraid to confess their sins. Her image was in bedrooms, on amulets, carved into combs. She was with you in the market, at the hearth in the barn, and sometimes she showed up in visions, appearing to shepherds, nuns, and even condemned prisoners with a message of mercy. There's a story from 13th century France about a woman accused of adultery. She was sentenced to death. On the morning of her execution, she prayed to Mary, begging for forgiveness. Legend says the Virgin appeared to the judge in a dream, asking for clemency. He woke, shaken, and set the woman free. It's one of many such tales where Mary steps in to save women from the very system that weaponized her image, as if the Church's fantasy Mary and the people's Mary were two different women entirely. Modern scholars still debate her role. Was she a symbol of patriarchal oppression, a figure of secret feminine power, a blank canvas onto which centuries of neurosis were projected? Probably all of the above. What's clear is that she wasn't optional. You couldn't ignore Mary. She was in your prayers, your paintings, your choices, your shame. So here you are, kneeling in the back of a cold church, eyes fixed on the gilded statue above the altar. Mary looks down with her blank, perfect face. Cradling a child without a trace of fatigue. You're not her. You'll never be her. But tonight, in the silence, you whisper anyway. Be kind. You know what it's like, don't you? All right, let's take a break from all the guilt, fire, and cosmic virginity standards and peek into one of the most unexpected windows of medieval desire. Monastic doodles. Yes, you read that right. Deep within the thick, velvet-silenced walls of monasteries, where men were supposed to spend their days fasting, praying, and denying every physical urge, you'll find margins of manuscripts decorated with what can only be described as the medieval version of locker room graffiti. And it is glorious. You're flipping through a 13th century prayer book. At first glance, it's everything you'd expect: delicate gold leaf borders, saintly figures in robes, crucifixes. But then, just off to the side, nestled in a curl of vinework or lurking beneath the Latin text, there it is, a tiny, naked fapoid riding a snail. Or a pair of monks mooning each other. Or worse, a nun plucking phallic-shaped fruit from a tree while a demon grins nearby. What you're looking at is marginalia, and it's as if the monks just couldn't hold it in anymore. Let's be clear, these were no accidents. These weren't oops, my quill slipped moments. These were deliberate, carefully drawn, often quite skillful additions to otherwise holy texts, and while some of them were meant as allegory or satire, many were just weird. Anatomically improbable, comically obscene, and bursting with innuendo. You'll see rabbits wielding swords against humans, possibly commentary on sex roles, nuns cavorting with men in devil costumes, disembodied penises with wings. There are even entire books that feature marginalia so explicit, modern curators have quietly tucked them away from school field trips, because nothing kills a religious experience like a cartoon of someone kissing their own butt. So why were monks drawing this stuff? Let's start with boredom. Copying manuscripts was a slow, punishing job. You sat for hours, hunched over a desk, scratching ink onto parchment, with a feathered quill while squinting at tiny, cramped text. You were tired, hungry, and told daily to resist temptation. Naturally, your brain wandered. And sometimes that wandering found its way onto the page. Marginalia may have been a kind of pressure release, humour, mischief, or low-key rebellion against the suffocating expectations of spiritual life, but not all of it was just silly. Some scholars believe these images were coded commentaries on the hypocrisy and absurdity of religious rules. Take, for example, a series of drawings found in a 14th century psalter, where a knight battles a penis-shaped dragon. On the surface, it's ridiculous, but zoom out, and you might be looking at a satirical jab at purity culture, mocking the idea that sexual desire is a beast to be slain. Other manuscripts show monks fleeing from women with oversized genitalia, or being tempted by fruit that frankly looks nothing like apples. It's as if the monks were visually confessing all the things they couldn't say aloud. Some of the best examples come from England and France, where the production of illuminated manuscripts reached fever pitch in the High Middle Ages. There's the lutral psalter, packed with bizarre scenes of people bending over, animals in vaguely human positions, and characters flashing each other from behind bushes. Then there's the infamous Smithfield Decretals, which contains images of men fondling each other mid-sermon, alongside serious legal commentary. Imagine reading ecclesiastical law while a doodle of two monks spooning in the margin stares back at you. That's the Middle Ages in a nutshell. One part judgment, one part butt joke. And it wasn't just men. In convents, nuns sometimes added their own flair to texts. One manuscript contains a picture of a nun joyfully plucking penises off a tree and placing them in her basket with a sly smile on her face. Is it allegory? Satire? Literal fantasy? No one knows for sure, but it challenges the assumption that nuns lived in some kind of sterile, sexless bubble. They had humour, curiosity and urges just like everyone else. And when the pen met the parchment, those urges sometimes spilled out. Of course, not everyone in the church appreciated this artistic rebellion. Some scribes were punished if their marginalia went too far, especially if it appeared in sacred texts like the Bible or the Gospels. One monk was reportedly reassigned to kitchen duty for illustrating a psalm with a naked angel playing the lute on his rear end. Another was accused of defiling the holy word by drawing beasts with manly parts too prominent to ignore. But mostly, these drawings went unnoticed by the higher-ups, or they were tolerated as long as they stayed in the margins. And that's the key, the margins. That's where medieval people, even monks and nuns, stashed the truth. Not the official truth, the sanctioned public version of morality, but the messy human truth. The one that says, I'm tired of pretending I don't notice, I'm frustrated, I'm amused, I'm struggling. It's all there, drawn in tiny, cheeky lines beside the text that told them to deny everything. Modern scholars still argue over what marginalia means. Was it subversive, irreverent, just doodling gone too far? The consensus is that it's all of the above, and more than anything, it's proof that even within the most rigid institutions, people found ways to express themselves. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but quietly, between the lines. So here you are in the cloistered scriptorium, the candle burning low, your fingers aching from hours of writing the psalms. You reach for your quill, dip it in ink, and instead of a halo or a cross, you sketch a rabbit mooning a bishop. You laugh to yourself quietly. No one sees. No one needs to. You've confessed your truth the only way you're allowed to. Now let's step out of the monastery and back into the domestic world, because as much as the church tried to control sex through confession, penance, and the crushing weight of divine shame, it had far less power over what happened at the hearth. And here, in the smoky, bustling chaos of everyday medieval homes, the body had to do more than just sin and repent. It had to survive. And nowhere was that more evident than in the tangled, tender, often uncomfortable relationship between mothers, babies, and the women who nursed them. Welcome to the wet nurse dilemma. Imagine this. You're a noblewoman in 13th century France. You've just given birth in your family's manor house, surrounded by midwives, herbalists, and the nervous prayers of your husband pacing in the next room. The baby is healthy. You miraculously are alive. Everyone exhales. Now comes the first decision, and it's not what name to give the baby or when to have it baptized. It's this. Will you nurse the child yourself or hire someone else to do it? Because believe it or not, in medieval high society, breastfeeding your own child was seen as a kind of downgrade. The upper classes believed that their primary role was to produce heirs, not to feed them. Nursing was viewed as a task for someone lower born, someone whose milk was considered earthier, stronger, and, most importantly, not already attached to important political duties. After all, a noblewoman's time was supposed to be spent managing estates, producing more children, and attending to her spiritual life. Breastfeeding was long, messy, intimate work, and that made it inconvenient. Enter the wet nurse. She's typically a peasant woman who has recently given birth herself, and who's now being paid, or at least housed and fed, to nurse the child of a stranger. Sometimes she moves into the household, other times the baby is sent away to her cottage in the countryside. Either way, the bond she forms with the child is powerful. After all, she's not just providing calories, she's offering warmth, rhythm, comfort. She becomes a second mother in every sense but legal recognition. And that's where things get complicated, because medieval thinkers were obsessed with the idea that a woman's milk wasn't just food, it was moral substance. Some believed that milk was essentially transformed blood, meaning the moral and physical characteristics of the nurse could be passed to the baby through her body. If she was lazy, lewd, or unfaithful, her milk could make the child the same. If she was pious and hard-working, her milk would nourish the child's soul as well as its bones. Choosing a wet nurse, in other words, wasn't just a medical decision, it was spiritual chemistry. So how did you make sure your wet nurse didn't ruin your baby? Easy. You controlled her, strictly. Households imposed rules about what she could eat, how she spent her time, even when and how often she was allowed to have sex with her husband, if she was married at all. It was widely believed that pregnancy ruined the quality of milk, so wet nurses were often required to stay celibate for the duration of their contract. Some were locked in, others were monitored. A few were sent to live in religious households just to be safe. Imagine giving birth, losing your child to wet nursing arrangements, then being told your own milk isn't even fit for use. That was the reality for many peasant women. And yet wet nurses were both vital and vulnerable. Their labour made aristocratic life possible. But their position was always precarious. A noble woman might praise her nurse one week and dismiss her the next. A single perceived insult, a rumour of sexual misconduct, or a suggestion that her milk was sour could send her packing. Sometimes without pay. In the worst cases, she could be accused of witchcraft, especially if the baby died or grew ill. The link between women's bodies and suspicion ran deep, and wet nurses were caught in the middle. There's one particularly grim case recorded in 15th century Venice, where a nurse was blamed for the sudden death of a noble baby. The family accused her of transmitting death through milk, and brought her before the city magistrates. She was interrogated, whipped, and ultimately exiled from the city, not because there was proof, but because she was expendable, and because people needed someone to blame. But this wasn't just a noblewoman's dilemma. In peasant families, breastfeeding, or the lack of it, could be a matter of life and death. A mother with poor health, low supply, or another pregnancy on the way might struggle to keep a child alive. In rural villages, women helped each other. Sisters nursed each other's babies, grandmothers stepped in, and communities functioned on shared labour. This informal network of milk sharing was rarely documented, but almost certainly widespread. It was practical, it was intimate, and it quietly defied the church's efforts to regulate bodies from above. Of course, the church had its own thoughts. Theologians debated whether women who breastfed too affectionately risked becoming overly attached to their children, possibly placing maternal love above devotion to God. Others warned against wet nursing altogether, claiming it disrupted the natural bond between mother and child and encouraged laziness among the upper classes. And then there were the confessional manuals, which actually included questions about how a woman nursed. Too eagerly, sin with pride sin, while fantasizing about her husband or, God forbid, anyone else? Mega sin. Modern historians still argue about the emotional realities of all this. Some believe noble women detached themselves emotionally from their children because they rarely saw them in infancy. Others argue that women found ways to love deeply, even within a fractured system. What's clear is that breastfeeding wasn't just biology. It was politics, it was class, it was morality, spirituality, and occasionally quiet rebellion. And for the wet nurse, she existed in a kind of liminal space, half servant, half mother, present but invisible. Her milk sustained lives that would inherit titles, land, and names. But she herself would disappear from the records, known only as the nurse or the woman from the village. Her body was used, her intimacy hired, her value measured by the droplet. So here you are, swaying gently beside a cradle in a small cottage, a baby asleep against your chest. You hum something you don't remember learning. The fire crackles. Somewhere far away, his real mother is praying in a chapel, her hands clean, her gown embroidered. But here, you are the one who holds him. You are the one who feeds him. You are the one who watches over him when the wind howls and his fists curl like flower buds in his sleep. And tomorrow, you may be sent away. So far we've danced through bedrooms, monasteries, confession booths, and even breastfed a nobleman's heir. But now it's time to pack your satchel, grab your pilgrimage badge, and hit the road. Because as much as the medieval church wanted people rooted in place, spiritually grounded, morally fixed, real life had other plans. Trade routes, military campaigns, religious pilgrimages, and good old-fashioned wanderlust sent thousands of people crisscrossing Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And wherever they went, they brought more than relics and souvenirs. They brought stories, they brought cravings, and inevitably, they brought sexually transmitted infections. Welcome to the inconvenient truth of medieval travel. If you wandered far enough from home, the rules got blurrier, but the risks got much, much higher. S3x. Start with the Crusades, those glorious holy wars that were supposed to be about reclaiming Jerusalem for Christendom. Let's be real, they also became massive sexual free-for-alls. You had armies of unmarried men marching through foreign lands for years at a time, thousands of miles from their parishes, their priests, and any kind of female moral guidance. What did people think was going to happen? In the Crusader states, brothels were set up next to barracks. Camp followers travelled with the army, and local women, sometimes willingly, often not, became part of the sexual economy. Some knights wrote home about their struggles with temptation. Others didn't bother pretending. The church tried to intervene, of course. Popes issued edicts banning sex in the Holy Land. Preachers warned that any pleasure taken on the road would corrupt your mission. A few really devout crusaders allegedly took vows of chastity and broke them by Antioch. Some soldiers did penance between battles, others did neither. Because the truth is, when you're in a dusty outpost, bored, homesick, and certain that death could show up any minute with a flaming arrow, it's very hard to think about your soul, easier to think about your body, and someone else's. And what did they bring home from these escapades? Sometimes it was relics, a piece of the true cross, a saint's toe bone, a bit of cloth that might have brushed Christ's elbow once, but often they brought home disease. There's still debate among scholars about which STIs were most common in the Middle Ages. But gonorrhea and syphilis show up again and again in medical texts, though under different names. Burning pestilence, French disease, holy fur. One particularly dramatic description from a 15th century physician includes ulcers, hair loss, and, brace yourself, the rotting of the genitals, as if scorched by God. Medieval medicine, subtle as ever, the link between travel and disease became painfully obvious by the late Middle Ages. Ports, military roads, and pilgrimage routes became hotspots for transmission. Cities like Venice, Marseille, and London passed laws restricting where foreigners could lodge, and hospitals were set up not just for the sick, but for the morally suspect. Some towns even tried to regulate who could visit brothels and when, with limited success. One 14th century ordinance in Florence tried to restrict soldiers from sleeping with sex workers more than 3 times a week. Imagine being the person assigned to enforce that rule. But disease wasn't the only thing moving along these networks. Ideas were too. When pilgrims travelled to Santiago, Canterbury, Rome, or Jerusalem, they didn't just pray, they talked. They met people from other regions, swapped stories, shared local customs, and sometimes swapped entire worldviews. Alongside the religious relics, they brought back folk remedies for contraception, new ways of thinking about gender roles, and occasionally a strong dose of skepticism about what the church had been feeding them back home. There's even evidence that some medieval people viewed pilgrimage as a kind of romantic escape. Not officially, of course. Pilgrimage was supposed to be about penance, spiritual growth, and getting closer to God. But that didn't stop couples from treating it like a divine road trip. In one case, a married woman from Ghent convinced her husband to let her go on pilgrimage to Rome. She returned 6 months later with a new wardrobe, a suspicious tan, and a letter from a friend in Florence. In another, 2 young lovers planned a joint pilgrimage to Santiago, only they skipped the shrine entirely and eloped in Navarre. Were these exceptions? Sure, but they point to something deeper. Medieval people understood that distance created freedom. When you travel, no one knows your name, your sins feel smaller, your secrets have longer legs. And speaking of secrets, foreignness itself became eroticized. Exoticism, even in its earliest medieval form, carried sexual overtones. Travellers returning from the Middle East described the excessive beauty of local women, their flowing garments, their tempting customs. Some knights bragged of their Eastern conquests in letters home. Not land, not castles, but lovers. These stories were almost always exaggerated, filtered through Orientalist fantasy and steeped in superiority complexes. But they shaped how Western Europeans imagined sex outside their borders. Freer, riskier, and somehow both sinful and irresistible. Back home, this created a strange blend of paranoia and fascination. Foreigners were both desired and feared. They were imagined as morally lax, dangerously seductive carriers of disease, and yet totally enthralling. Pilgrims might claim they went to Jerusalem to kiss the rock where Christ stood, but everyone knew that what happened in Constantinople did not stay in Constantinople. That tension between piety and desire, reverence and rumour, defined so much of medieval travel. Even the church couldn't decide how to feel. On the one hand, pilgrimage was encouraged. It was a noble act of faith. On the other hand, too many people came back with suspicious rashes and stories that began with, "You'll never believe what I saw in Cyprus." Preachers warned against temptation on the road, particularly among women. There were actual sermons devoted to chaperone protocol. Some towns required young female pilgrims to travel in groups, supervised by older women or clerics. That didn't always stop them. Modern historians now look at these patterns and see a very human story. Movement makes desire harder to control. You leave behind your neighbours, your priest, your daily shame, and suddenly, possibilities open. People explore, people indulge, and sometimes people pay for it, with coin, with reputation, or with a burning pestilence that no amount of holy water could quite cure. So here you are, feet sore from walking the Camino de Santiago, sunburned, tired, but buzzing with something you can't quite name. You met someone in a village back in Aragon. You kissed. It didn't mean anything, or maybe it meant too much. You told yourself it was the wine, the moment, the journey. Tomorrow you'll light a candle at the shrine and pray for your soul. But tonight, you think of their laugh, their fingers, the way you forgot who you were, just for a moment. You wonder what you've brought home, and whether it was worth it. By now, you've probably figured out that medieval life was steeped in contradictions. Sexuality was pleased, but also sold. Purity was praised, but impossible. Rules were handed down from pulpits, while real life throbbed underneath with every temptation the church tried and failed to control. But if you really want to understand the fear baked into the medieval view of the body, especially women's bodies, you need to step into the most shadowed corner of all, the intersection of sex, fertility, and witchcraft. Because in a world where childbirth was risky, medicine was guesswork, and women were rarely allowed formal power, midwives and wise women occupied a fragile, dangerous space. One moment they were protectors of life, the next they were blamed for killing it. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, the average woman was expected to have between 6 and 10 children, but half of those children, if not more, wouldn't survive infancy. Add to that the fact that many women died giving birth, and you've got a constant sense of panic surrounding fertility. Families prayed for healthy babies, women begged saints to help them conceive. Every miscarriage, stillbirth, or long stretch of barrenness became a source of whispered suspicion. And when medicine failed, as it often did, people turned to folk knowledge, herbs, charms, old wives' remedies passed down for generations, and the people who carried that knowledge, midwives. Midwives weren't just childbirth attendants. They were medical advisors, emotional support systems, fertility experts, herbalists, and spiritual guides. Some of them knew how to turn a breech birth. Others could recognize signs of postpartum infection. A few even performed rudimentary surgeries using knives and hot water. But their most controversial skill was knowing how to control fertility, both encouraging it and, when needed, stopping it. That made them both essential and deeply suspicious. Because if a woman knew how to prevent pregnancy, or worse, end one, she held power the church couldn't always monitor. And nothing terrified the medieval patriarchy more than a woman with unregulated knowledge of the female body. Which is how we get to the slow-burning fear that turned midwives into witches. The word witch itself was slippery in the medieval period. Sometimes it meant a healer, sometimes a heretic, sometimes just a woman who lived alone and had a cat. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, as anxieties about women's independence, bodily control and declining birth rates increased, the definition of witch became darker, more violent, and more sexual. It wasn't enough to say someone used herbs incorrectly. You had to accuse them of using sex to cause harm. Suddenly, witches were being described as women who made men impotent, who caused miscarriages with potions, who stole semen to make magical ointments, who copulated with demons disguised as handsome strangers. Yes, you read that right. One of the most persistent medieval myths was that witches had sex with demons, incubi they were called, who visited them at night to fill them with unholy seed. Some inquisitors even claimed witches kept lists of their demon lovers and described their experiences in grotesque detail. Whether these women actually confessed or were coerced into saying what interrogators wanted to hear under torture, well, you can probably guess. And who were the most common targets of these witch hunts? Widows, single women, midwives. In other words, women without male protectors, women who knew too much about blood, birth, herbs, and pleasure. Sometimes the accusation came from a neighbour with a grudge. Other times it came after a child died, and someone needed to blame someone. One French woman was accused of being a witch because she helped 3 other women miscarry after they were impregnated by travelling soldiers. The town's priest claimed she had killed future keels. She was burned at the stake, slowly as a lesson. The tragedy is that many of these witches were simply doing what the church failed to do. Keeping women alive, they offered pain relief when men wouldn't. They provided contraception when the church demanded pregnancy. Well, They listened to confessions that priests wouldn't tolerate, and they did it in kitchens, in back rooms, in forests at dusk, wherever the candles could be lit and the herbs could be brewed. But here's the thing, not everyone feared them. Plenty of women needed their help. Even church wives, yes, priests weren't supposed to marry, but it happened, quietly sought out midwives for potions, advice and private procedures. Wealthy women paid for their services in secret. Peasant women brought gifts, bread, eggs, chickens, just to keep them close. The power they wielded was always fragile, always at risk. But it was real. Fertility magic too lived in this grey area between faith and superstition. Some women wore amulets made from dried rabbit bones to increase conception. Others whispered prayers to St. Margaret, the patron of childbirth, while slipping mandrake root into their drink. There were rituals that involved burying a piece of your hair in the garden during a full moon. There were songs that were only sung by women, passed down orally, never written, meant to calm the womb or welcome the seed. Were they effective? Who knows? But they made people feel seen, in a world that usually ignored them. Even men got into it. Some medieval husbands carried fertility charms in their belts. One popular folk belief said a man could improve his potency by rubbing his thighs with owl fat mixed with mint and wine. We do not recommend testing this. Others drank concoctions with names like Venus's Blessing or Adam's Strength. They believed in aphrodisiac foods, roasted parsnips, cinnamon, dried figs, eggs soaked in goat's milk. The line between superstition and science was thin, and honestly, the food wasn't helping. Today, historians debate whether midwives were systematically targeted or whether witch hunts were more sporadic, more locally driven. But most agree that women with knowledge of reproduction, especially those outside church-sanctioned roles, were always walking a fine line. A midwife might be praised one year and condemned the next. Her charm might be holy in one village and blasphemous in the next. And the accusations were never just about herbs or spells, they were about power. Who had it? Who deserved it? Who had the nerve to wield it without asking? So here you are, crouched by a fire in a tiny stone cottage, mortar in hand, grinding dried rue and pennyroyal, while a woman watches you with eyes wide from pain and panic. Outside, the church bells ring. You whisper a blessing under your breath, not because the church taught you to, but because your mother did. You hand her the tea, you wait, and when the pain eases, when the bleeding slows, when her hand finds yours in the dark, you feel something deeper than fear, not power, not defiance, just knowing. And that's enough. All right, let's roll back into the castles for a second, into the drafty stone halls and fur-lined beds of the nobility. Because while peasants were getting married in muddy fields and praying their children lived past 5, the upper classes were embroiled in a very different kind of sexual drama. Here, sex wasn't just about sin or survival, it was about strategy. Welcome to the bizarre and bureaucratic world of dynastic marriage and inheritance, where who you slept with, and when, could determine who got the land, the title and the kingdom. If you were born noble in the Middle Ages, your body wasn't really yours. Your virginity, especially if you were female, was a political asset. Your fertility was a negotiation tool. Your marriage was usually decided when you were still in the cradle, if not before. And when it came time to tie the knot, it was less about love and more about land, property, alliances. Whether your future spouse had all their teeth was less important than whether they had a claim to Normandy. Let's say you're a noblewoman in 14th century England. You're 13, which is prime marriage age if your uterus works and you haven't died of dysentery. Your father arranges your betrothal to a slightly older boy from another landed family. The ceremony is conducted. The vows are exchanged, though not always consummated right away. That depends on whether you're physically mature enough, which is as vague and unscientific as it sounds. In some cases, consummation is delayed for years. In others, it's rushed to seal a deal or produce a male heir before someone keels over from gout. The pressure to produce that heir is relentless. A noble marriage without children, specifically sons, was a failure. Your value as a woman was largely determined by how quickly and efficiently you could pump out the next generation. A barren noblewoman, even if beloved, could be cast aside, sent to a convent, or quietly replaced with a younger model. A barren man, of course, was rarely blamed. Infertility was almost always pinned on the woman, regardless of what was actually going on in the couple's bed. And if you did manage to have children, congrats, but the work wasn't over. Now you had to protect their inheritance, which meant proving they were legitimate, that you hadn't stepped out of bounds, that your husband was definitely the father. Enter the bedroom spy culture. Yes, medieval noble marriages often came with a strange little ceremony called the bedding ritual. After the wedding feast, the couple was escorted to bed, sometimes by half the court. There were prayers, songs, and yes, people literally stood in the room while the couple lay down. Some would stay so they were sure consummation had happened. Others would examine the sheets the next morning for blood, grotesque and often an unreliable sign of virginity lost. And if there wasn't blood, well, cue the gossip, the annulment petitions, and possibly even war, depending on who was set to inherit what. Because remember, marriage in the noble world was a contract. If you could prove it wasn't properly consummated, it could be nullified. And if you wanted out of a marriage later on, you could claim impotence, fraud, or spiritual incompatibility. But the most popular route? Accusing your spouse of sexual failure. One noblewoman claimed her husband could not do his duty except under a full moon, and only if reciting Latin backward. Another man claimed his wife refused sex because she believed it lowered the angel's opinion of her. So yeah, sex became legal evidence. And as you can imagine, people learned to lie, exaggerate, and manipulate the system. Men faked impotence to get out of unwanted marriages. Women faked pregnancies. Midwives forged proofs of virginity. There are entire legal records full of these cases, some tragic, some hilarious, all soaked in sexual politics. One of the most infamous examples is the Great Schism in France and England after the marriage of King Edward III's son to the Philippa of Hainault. When their son died young, questions swirled about the legitimacy of the marriage, whether the child had been properly conceived and who had the right to rule next. The resulting dynastic mess helped set the stage for the 100 Years' War. So yes, a questionable royal bedchamber situation may have indirectly led to a century of bloodshed. Medieval sex wasn't just messy, it was geopolitical. And don't think women were passive in all this. Noble women learned to play the game too. Some became power brokers in their own right. They arranged marriages for their children, secured alliances through seduction or influence, and in some cases, took lovers discreetly when their political marriages left them cold. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to not one but 2 kings, bore 10 children, joined a crusade, and still managed to squeeze in a rebellion or 2. She was admired, feared, and definitely not obedient. Still, discretion was everything. An affair that stayed secret could be overlooked. One that became public could ruin a dynasty. A noblewoman caught cheating could lose her lands, her children, or her head. Literally. Men were less likely to face those consequences, unless their lover was someone else's wife or a nun. Even then, they usually got off with a fine or a brief pilgrimage. And if they were kings, forget it. Royal mistresses were practically a job category. Some noble women wielded sex as leverage. They knew when to withhold it, when to offer it, and when to turn their gaze toward the priest or the page boy instead. But every move had to be calculated, because one wrong step, one rumour, one jealous servant's whispered accusation, and it was all over. Not just for you, but for your children, your family, your bloodline. It's exhausting, right? The constant pressure to perform, to produce, to pretend. Even love, when it happened, had to be folded inside strategy. There's a quiet heartbreak in that. Knowing your body belongs to a marriage contract, your bed to your father's ambitions, your womb to a family name. So here you are, sitting on the edge of a carved oak bed, your new husband beside you, the chambermaid folding down the sheets. There are candles burning, a priest outside the door, and a piece of linen ready for proof. You're young, you're scared, you barely know the man beside you. But you know what's expected. You've been taught how to breathe, how to lie still, how to bleed. And tomorrow you'll wake up married, to a name, a land, a future that isn't quite yours. So now you've heard how sex could shape empires, damn souls, and incite actual wars. But let's take a detour into something a little quieter, stranger and more intimate. Because for all the rules and rituals that tried to contain sex, medieval people still had imaginations. Wild, messy, oddly specific imaginations. And sometimes, what they did with those thoughts ended up recorded. Not in laws or sermons, but in dreams. Welcome to the world of medieval erotic visions. Fantasies that teetered between the sacred and the scandalous, the confessional and the carnal, often wrapped in the language of mysticism but soaked in unmistakable desire. Here's the scene. You're a monk, cloistered behind thick walls, supposedly dedicated to prayer, fasting, and the renunciation of all things fleshly. But one night, in the dark quiet of your cell, you dream of a golden-haired angel kissing your neck. You wake up sweating, ashamed, convinced the devil has found a way in. Or maybe you're a mystic, a woman considered especially holy, and in your visions, Christ appears not as a bleeding man on a cross, but as a radiant bridegroom who enters your body as light fills the sky. The dream leaves you in tears, and not just from spiritual ecstasy. These weren't isolated cases. Throughout the Middle Ages, men and women, especially religious ones, wrote about deeply sensual visions. Some were clearly symbolic, meant to illustrate divine love. Others were harder to explain away. Saint Lutgard of Aiguière described a vision where Jesus pressed his bleeding heart to her lips. St. Catherine of Siena claimed she was married to Christ in a mystical union so intense it made her feel faint. These weren't coy metaphors, they were full-body experiences tinged with unmistakable erotic energy. And people noticed. Some theologians encouraged this kind of devotion. They believed that spiritual longing could and should mirror romantic desire. After all, wasn't God the ultimate beloved? Wasn't heaven a kind of eternal consummation? But others found it suspicious. Too many tears, too much trembling, too many holy women clutching their chests and moaning during prayer. Were these really divine encounters, or was something else happening? Something less pure, more bodily? There's a scholarly debate that still rages about this. Were medieval mystics experiencing religious ecstasy, or just highly sanctified orgasms? To be fair, there's no definitive answer, but some of the descriptions are difficult to ignore. Take the writings of Mechtild of Magdeburg, a 13th century Beguine who wrote that divine love enters me, and my soul opens like a flower in spring. Elsewhere she describes lying on Christ's breast and feeling all pain dissolve in sweetness. It's not hard to see how the lines blurred between spiritual union and sensual abandon. Even male mystics weren't immune. St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote pages of commentary on the Song of Songs, an Old Testament book of erotic poetry, interpreting the bride's yearning as the soul longing for Christ. But every once in a while, the interpretations got suspiciously personal. Bernard would describe being pierced by divine desire, drunk on God's sweetness, and naked before love itself. That's a lot of emotional exposure for someone allegedly avoiding all earthly temptations. And here's where things get even more interesting. Many of these visions occurred not during sleep, but during the intense fasting, isolation, or self-flagellation. In other words, people were altering their physical states, depriving themselves of food, sleep, and comfort, until their brains started producing some very vivid material. The line between devotion and delirium was thin. Some mystics openly admitted they had no idea where their visions came from. "It came upon me," one wrote, "like fire through the belly." Another claimed she saw angels kissing her after being whipped. Coincidence? You decide. Meanwhile, the church walked a tightrope. On one hand, these mystics were popular. Their visions inspired the others, gave shape to emotional experiences that weren't otherwise allowed. On the other, they were hard to control. A mystic could claim a vision that contradicted church doctrine, and what then? You couldn't exactly punish someone for what God allegedly told them in a dream, unless of course you suspected it wasn't God, which is why some mystics were venerated after death, and others were accused of heresy. And let's not pretend these erotic visions were limited to saints. Everyday people, especially those with limited access to formal education, processed their desires through dreams, songs, and stories passed around like whispers. A woman might dream of a knight appearing in her bed, glowing with divine light. A man might dream of a lady with hair like sun rays who promises him paradise if he remains chaste, only to wake up in sweat-soaked guilt. These weren't random thoughts. They were ways of navigating longing in a world that allowed no space for it. When your body's needs are criminalized, your brain does the heavy lifting. Some tales even blurred the line between eroticism and horror. There are accounts of people visited in their sleep by succubi, female demons said to seduce men and steal their seed. These dreams were often vivid, terrifying, and wildly sexual. Medieval medicine took them seriously, with some physicians claiming they were caused by excessive heat in the loins or a wandering imagination. Others blamed sleep paralysis. The church? It blamed the devil. Of course, and yet people kept dreaming. They dreamed of touching being touched, of holding and being held, of connection, yes, but also of release. Because even in a world that insisted your body was a battlefield, your dreams remained your own. No priest could enter them. No confession could extract them. No bishop could burn them. What makes all this so human, so tragically beautiful, is how many of these dreams ended in silence. In the morning the mystic woke and told no one, or they wrote it down and hid the parchment, or they whispered it to their confessor with downcast eyes. They were terrified, not just of punishment, but of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the vision wasn't divine at all, just longing, just hunger. So here you are, alone in your cell. The candle burns low. Your lips still move from prayers you no longer feel. And then, sleep. The veil lifts. And there, in the space between dream and desire, someone waits. Not God, not the devil, just the shape of want, soft and impossible. You reach, you wake, you do not tell, but you remember. At this point you might be wondering, was anyone having sex without guilt, fear, or political strings attached? Was there any corner of the medieval world where people could just, enjoy each other? Well, maybe. You'd have to squint a little, look past the scribes, the bishops, the laws, past the monks with their goose-feather pens and gilt. You'd have to dig into the cracks between worlds, into the carnivals, the folk tales, the feast day drunkenness, and the quiet nights behind tavern shutters. Because there, for a few stolen hours, people let go, and when they did, the rules didn't disappear, they just got mocked. Let's talk about the medieval carnival, and not the kind with cotton candy and rigged ring tosses. These were the original role reversal parties. A topsy-turvy, church-approved, but only barely holiday, where peasants dressed as priests, men dressed as women, and the town fool got to play king. Think of it as a social pressure valve, a controlled chaos meant to mock authority just enough to survive the rest of the year under it. And oh, did it come with sex. During carnival season, especially in the lead up to Lent, villages exploded with bawdy songs, masked dances, lewd plays, and a kind of giddy lawlessness. Priests turned a blind eye, sometimes they even joined in. There are records of mock weddings, fake trials for lustful crimes, and public performances where actors mimicked priests delivering sermons about chastity, while carrying sausages that looked suspiciously anatomical. Feast days too carried their own subversions. Take May Day, for instance. Originally a pagan celebration of fertility, it stuck around long after Christianity tried to clean it up. People gathered flowers, lit bonfires, and snuck off into the woods in pairs or trios. A romp in the greenwood wasn't just a poetic phrase, it was an actual tradition. Local authorities often grumbled about the pregnancies that followed 9 months later, but they tolerated it, because even they knew that you couldn't repress people forever. Folk songs from this time are peppered with cheeky metaphors. Ploughing fields, shearing sheep, grinding grain, every one of them a euphemism for something much more entertaining, and everyone knew it. There's a famous line from a 14th century English ballad, "I'll lay thee down upon the moss and show thee how to thresh." Spoiler, no one's harvesting wheat. In these moments, the ordinary man and woman weren't thinking about sin. They weren't calculating penance or reciting Latin prayers. They were laughing, drinking, reaching for each other under the soft flicker of torchlight. Desire didn't feel dangerous. It felt normal. And not just straight desire either. Carnival blurred all lines, gender, class, orientation. Men cross-dressed, women courted each other publicly, and everyone played at being someone else. Whether these role plays translated into actual sexual encounters is harder to prove, but it's likely. In a space where nothing was serious, everything could be tried. And what happened at Carnival? Well, it didn't exactly stay at Carnival, but people agreed to pretend it did. Taverns and bathhouses, especially in cities, offered similar zones of blurred boundaries. The church despised bathhouses, associating them with filthy pleasures, which usually meant people enjoying their own bodies in warm water without shame. Bathhouses weren't just for bathing, they were social spaces. You drank, you ate, you flirted. Sometimes you rented a private room. Some bathhouses doubled as brothels. Others didn't, but still carried that charged atmosphere of bodies in close quarters. And in cities like Paris, London, and Cologne, bathhouse culture thrived despite repeated church crackdowns. Even among the peasantry, there were places of erotic openness. Not every marriage was loveless. Not every sex act was a duty. Some couples actually liked each other. Some looked forward to those brief moments of privacy, rare as they were. Maybe it was in the hayloft while the baby slept. Maybe behind the hedge after chores, quick, clumsy, whispered, and completely their own. And here's a strange twist. Some court records from the period show couples being prosecuted not just for illicit sex, but for sex that was too joyful. One case in 15th century Germany involved a woman accused of wanton laughter during intercourse with her husband. Another from Italy saw a man fined for ungodly noises while coupling with his wife. The takeaway: pleasure itself was suspect, and that tells you something. People were enjoying it, enough to draw attention. You even see this in medieval literature. Not the lofty courtly love stuff, but the popular tales. Fabliaux, they were called. Short, bawdy, often filthy stories told for laughs. A miller tricks a priest. A cunning wife sleeps with 3 men in one night without getting caught. A clergyman accidentally blesses a chamber pot instead of a holy relic. These stories were wildly popular, passed around orally, scribbled into manuscripts alongside more serious works. They weren't just about laughing at authority. They were about living, about mocking the very rules that tried to crush human desire into submission. Some of them are surprisingly explicit. There's one Fabliaux where a woman convinces her husband she's been possessed by a lusty spirit, and the only way to exorcise it is to let the neighbour sleep with her. Spoiler, the exorcism is very successful. Another tells of a widow who refuses to remarry unless the suitor passes a test involving, let's just say, a wooden replica and a measuring contest. These weren't subtle. They were sex-affirming, body-positive, and refreshingly honest about the gap between what people should do and what they actually did. Even some clergy couldn't help but smile. One 12th century bishop commenting anonymously on Fabliaux wrote, "They are crude, certainly, but truthful, and even the devil must laugh now and then." Which is possibly the most backhanded approval in history. It's easy to imagine everyone back then as either oppressed or oppressor, but the truth lived somewhere in between. People found joy. They snuck it in between the cracks, in jokes, in feasts, in stories told after dark. They knew the rules, but they also knew how to bend them, sometimes with stealth, sometimes with sarcasm, sometimes with wild abandon under a full moon in a field of buttercups. So here you are, cheeks flushed with ale, stumbling into a festival square lit with lanterns and voices. Someone hands you a meat pie, someone else grabs your hand. You don't ask who they are, you just dance. The lute plays something fast and old. Your body knows it better than your memory. The night smells like spice and wood smoke. You're spinning, laughing, wanting, and for once, no one is watching. Not the priest. Not the judge, not even God. So you've danced through the festival, escaped the bishop's eye, maybe even rolled around in a hayloft with someone whose name you never asked. But the question still hangs in the air, doesn't it? After all the rules, the rituals, the whispered jokes, and the burning shame, how did things change? How did we get from a world where sex was a public matter of eternal consequence to one where it's mostly considered a private, personal decision? The answer isn't one neat moment or revolution. It's a slow, gritty crawl. A messy, uneven birth of an idea we now take for granted. Privacy. To understand this shift, you've got to revisit the basic setup of medieval life. Privacy in the modern sense didn't exist. Homes were one-room affairs. Even noble households lacked what we'd now call personal space. Servants slept near their masters. Parents slept near their children. Couples had sex with people in earshot or eyesight. And that wasn't weird. It was normal. Life was communal because survival was communal. You knew your neighbour's business, and they knew yours. Sex, especially within marriage, was seen as a duty, performance of loyalty to God, family, and social order. Not something to be shielded behind locked doors, but by the 14th and 15th centuries things began to shift. Slowly, cities grew, wealth accumulated, more people had the means to demand space, separate chambers, locked trunks, curtains, shutters. Architecture changed. So did expectations. Nobles started commissioning withdrawing rooms and private studies. The church even encouraged some separation, mostly so men could contemplate God undisturbed. But the effect was bigger than anyone realised. Space began to feel personal. Intimacy got physical boundaries. You see this reflected in etiquette books from the late Middle Ages. They start telling people not to kiss in public, not to speak of bodily matters around company. One 15th century guidebook warns women not to touch their husbands too freely at table, lest it provoke base thoughts. The message? Keep it inside, make it tidy, private. Even marriages became less performative. Bedding ceremonies faded. The bloody sheet obsession lost steam, not overnight, but enough that eventually couples could marry and go to bed without half the village watching through the window. At the same time, the legal system started shifting. Courts moved away from public confessions and toward written testimony. Confession itself, still mandatory, became less theatrical and more internalized. By the early 16th century, priests were being trained to ask fewer graphic questions and focus more on intent. Did you lust in your heart? Did you regret it? The emphasis began sliding from action to thought, from body to soul, and then there's the printing press. When Gutenberg rolled out his Bible in the mid-1400s, no one could have predicted that within a century printed pamphlets about sex, how to avoid it, how to enjoy it, how to reconcile it with God would be everywhere. People could read in private, learn in private, reflect in private. Literacy quietly built the walls that architecture had only just started sketching out. But make no mistake, this was not a smooth ride toward freedom. The invention of privacy also created new ways to shame. Now that sex could be hidden, it could be judged more harshly when exposed. Think about it. In a society where everyone knows your business, your indiscretions are expected. But when everyone's pretending to be modest, your slip-up becomes scandal. The late Middle Ages gave birth to hypocrisy in its most elegant form, moral panic in velvet robes. This contradiction birthed an entire genre of literature and art. Court records got juicier. Satirical poems about priests caught in brothels exploded in popularity. One woodcut series from 1490 shows a clergyman chasing a woman with his robes hitched up, only to be beaten over the head by her husband. Another depicts two women in bed, mid-kiss, as a snooping neighbour peeks through the window, scandalised but also very obviously watching with interest. The message: everyone said sex belonged in private, but no one could look away when it wasn't. And just like that, shame changed shape. No longer purely religious, it became social. Instead of fearing God, people feared each other. A woman might have a tryst and feel less afraid of hellfire than of her neighbour's gossip. A man caught with a lover might not confess to a priest, but he'd still try to bribe the town crier. Sex left the pulpit and entered the rumour mill. The surveillance didn't stop, it just got more subtle. But even with all that, there was progress. Because with privacy came something else: possibility. People could choose more, whisper more, explore more. Some noblewomen began keeping diaries, tiny coded records of love affairs, frustrations and hopes. Servants passed love notes. Soldiers wrote letters home that weren't just about the war. "I dream of you," one wrote, "and when I return may we be alone for many days." That line would have been unthinkable 200 years earlier. We also see the slow rise of secular marriage, not immediately replacing religious rites but running alongside them. A legal contractual partnership with mutual obligations and, if you were lucky, maybe even affection. The idea of sex as mutual pleasure, not just duty or sin, started to creep into literature, especially in the works of early humanist writers. There were still sermons, of course, still all rules, still all penances, but they didn't feel so absolute anymore. People had choices. Not many, but more than before. And maybe that's the biggest shift of all. Not that sex became freer, but that it became negotiated, on quieter terms. Between fewer people, with fewer eyes watching, it didn't always go well, it didn't always feel good, but it belonged more and more to the people actually doing it. So here you are, standing at the edge of a very old world. The church bells still ring, the laws still exist, but your room has a door, a lock, a candle of your own. Someone sits beside you, not assigned, not arranged, just chosen. There's no audience, no blood-stained sheet to display, no priest outside the door waiting to ask if it counted. Just two people, one quiet room, and whatever happens next, that's for you alone. So here we are, drifting back to the surface, lanterns dimmed and horses cooled, the last of the torchlight flickering out behind us. You've made it through 25 winding candlelit chapters of medieval love, lust, law, and all the uncomfortable contradictions that tied them in knots. You've peeked through bedroom curtains in royal palaces and ducked behind hedgerows with the shepherd girls. You've walked the cloister halls with monks who tried very hard not to think about naked angels, and passed through plague-ridden streets where sex could be healing, dangerous, forbidden, or sometimes all three. And maybe now you're wondering what to do with it all. What does it mean? Well, it means that human beings have always been messy. They've always craved connection and bumped up against the rules that tried to limit it. They've always carried around complicated bodies full of longing and tried to make sense of those bodies using the tools they had, be they religion, tradition, folklore, or just plain hope. The Middle Ages weren't a monolith of repression. They were a swirl of paradoxes, chastity and carnality, devotion and desire, punishment and pleasure, all bound together by systems that didn't always agree with themselves. And yet people lived in that contradiction. They laughed, cried, snuck kisses under bridges, and yes, sometimes got dragged in front of a bishop for doing it. But they lived. They improvised. They found loopholes. They whispered and wrote poems in secret and scratched rude drawings in the corners of sacred texts. They were clever and complicated and completely recognisable. You may not share their beliefs, but you'd recognise the ache. You'd understand the thrill of a furtive glance, the warmth of a shared bed on a cold night, the frustration of wanting more freedom than your world allows. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a history of medieval sex rules, it's a history of what people did with those rules. Some obeyed, some broke them, most fell somewhere in between, just like now. The costumes are different, sure, but the story? It's familiar, it's human. So if you're lying there in the dark, maybe a little more informed than when we started, maybe a little weirded out by those airborne penises and seductive saints, that's okay. You survived it. Barely, but you made it. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild little tour of medieval bedroom diplomacy. If it made you think, laugh, cringe, or raise an eyebrow, you know what to do. Drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what weird fact is now living rent-free in your brain. And don't forget to tell me your city and the time it is right now. I love knowing who's out there listening in the quiet. Now, take a breath, roll onto your side, pull the blanket up just a bit higher. The Middle Ages are behind you.